To the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance joint hearings on the fiscal year 2018 budget for the town of Fairfield. Can I have everybody please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? And since we're discussing the Board of Education tonight, I'm going to ask Superintendent Dr. Jones to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance this evening.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome, everyone. This evening, as I mentioned, we have 4 items on the agenda. We're going to have a summary budget presentation by the Superintendent of Schools. We're going to discuss the Board of Education budget, the Health and Welfare Services budget, and the private school bus transportation budget. Before we get started tonight, a couple of items. Number one, I'm in receipt of a letter that was delivered to the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, correct? Wasn't that? From Governor Malloy. And First Selectman Tetra and Selectman Timniak both forwarded that letter. And because of the confusion up at the state level, they're discussing potentially moving back the date that we need to approve the fiscal year budget by. I don't have any additional information on that to you, Mr. Tetra.
Yeah, I think that it was I was at CCM meeting this morning. It was a hot topic of conversation. What they're doing is looking at passing a statute that would provide towns the ability to delay if they chose. It's allowing act. It's not requiring it.
Yep.
In that sense. So it's something we want to keep in mind. I'm not sure, based on how it works, it may be necessarily very helpful to us, but at this point, it gives us some flexibility. I believe the state will discuss some different things like that over the next month, so we should know on that sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Mr. Tetra. And what that has to do with is the very real issue we're struggling with as a town, is the fact that the governor's budget is the latest document that we have to go by, and that document causes us about a $14 million hole in the budget right now that we're wrestling with, that the administration is wrestling with. And the current time frame, the state doesn't have to finish its budget until after we finish ours. So that gives us a problem as to how do we deal with that $14 million, and is it in fact $14 million? So we're trying to buy time here, get as much information as possible, get the best available information so that we make the right decision for the taxpayers. So we'll continue to monitor that. In addition, I have requested from the town attorney on behalf of our boards some guidance as it relates to our ability to adjust the mill rate once the state budget is passed, whether that be in June or whether that be in September. Because there has been some discussion about our opportunity to do that after the original mill rate is set right now in early May, after the RTM completes their review of the budget.
Correct, and as best we can tell right now, there isn't any allowance that lets us adjust the mill rate downward after it's been set. Though I was talking with the Speaker of the House on Monday, raised that issue, and he seemed to take that under advisement that they may look at something along those lines too. But at this point, everything is very fluid.
Mm-hmm. So we'll keep you informed as we get guidance and information as we move forward. The last item is, because we are talking about the Board of Education budget, and because it gets highly emotional and highly charged, and because obviously the financial stress put on the town this year, I just wanted to give a word of caution to our audience here in attendance and our audience at home. And that is, based on past experience, people tend to read into questions. They tend to read into comments that board members or members of the administration might make during these deliberations. I would ask that you don't jump to those conclusions. Our job here is to ask difficult and tough questions to get a better understanding of how taxpayer dollars are being spent.
It's just because
There typically is no political motivation beyond that, to get the best available information so that we can make the appropriate decision for all the taxpayers of the town of Fairfield. Also, keep in mind that these boards, the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance, only get to vote on one number. They don't get to vote on how the dollars are spent after we approve it. That's under the sole discretion of the Board of Education. So while we might ask questions, we might look at different areas, we might explore what can be done, it is not within the control of anybody on these boards to make those final decisions. So don't read into them, understand what our role is in the process, please. And there will be time for public comment at the end of this discussion. Any questions, comments, or concerns from my colleagues?
Just one.
Yes?
Just in relation to the mill rate adjustment, I think that we had that as a follow-up as well for potential Fairfield legislation to reduce the mill rate if needed, as you know, possibly getting that down to the RTM and getting it through the process, because it takes 3, sometimes up to 4 months, even when rushed. So,
Mr. Tetra and Mr. Mayor, can you make sure that the town attorney's letter addresses any ability to do that as well, or what steps the RTM might need to take?
Well, I think, yes, I think Mr. Becker was referring to a change in the town code that
Correct.
would create that opportunity.
And I want to see if that's possible. Under state statute, can we do that?
yes, thank you.
Sure. Okay? Any other, thank you, Mr. Becker. Any other questions, comments? Seeing none, I'm going to turn it over quickly to the superintendent of schools and the chairman of the Board of Education. Dr. Jones, once more time, welcome.
Thank you.
I wish it was under more pleasant budget circumstances, as I'm sure you do, but I'm sure you'll do a fine job, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. We look forward to answering your questions, presenting some basic information to you, and then having any Q&A that you may have. I thank at least 3 of our board members. There might have been others who have come in since I've turned and faced you. Anthony Calabrese, our vice chair, Jessica Gerber, our secretary, Tricia Pitko, a member of the board. We have Friends of Education here. And so I look forward to presenting. You might notice that my voice is not what it normally is, and normally we have kind of tag-teamed this, talking about different slides. Dr. Jones will present the entire presentation, and I'll chime in only if a question is directed to me.
Thank God. No, did I say that out loud? All right, so we'll turn it over, and I think you want to use the projector, so we'll get out of the way.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'll just say good evening to the Board of Selectmen and to the Board of Finance. I'm delighted to be here tonight to present the Fairfield Board of Education proposed operating budget. We're going to start out by looking at a little bit of revenue and spending history. And when we look at the budget process, from September through January, there's a tremendous amount of work that takes place. And I just think it's worthwhile to go back and talk just very briefly about all of the work that the staff do in leading up to presenting the superintendent's budget, and then the work that the board does to have a board's proposed budget. First, we examine the 2016-2017 budget thoroughly. We examine all of our staffing adjustments or changes that we know may need to be made within that next budget. We look at our estimated fixed cost, what are the required staffing, what's happening, we think, with healthcare. We did meet with every headmaster, all of our principal teams at every level. We also met with every department leader on all of those needs. We gather all of our local, state, and federal funding information. Now, mind you, this budget is based off work that was done in the fall before the governor's budget, and that has had some big impacts this year. We also gather all of our new enrollment projection data. And just the next section, we have a couple of slides on revenue and spending history, just for those of you that may be new to the budget process, or those of you that just may want a reminder of how the Board of Education budget is spent. First of all, when you look at a school budget, All of that blue that you see on that pie graph, that's where the majority of our budget is spent. It's on salaries and benefits. Schools are people-driven businesses, so 78% of our budget is driven on our staff. And what that means is when we do see a budget reduction or something that the governor has put forward, it's a little bit scary for us because we don't have a lot of wiggle room in school budgets. The next thing we want to look at is, are we spending that salary component and that benefit component really well? And what you're seeing in the orange is that 75% of those people are the people that are most important. They're the ones in the classrooms with our children. Are we spending the money on instruction? The small kind of areas on that left-hand side, you're looking at classroom support and other supports that also go directly to the classroom. So 85% of our staffing are those people who are working with children. And then, of course, we have those other areas that are necessary, like facilities and maintenance and other areas. When you look at our preschool through grade 12 enrollment, you'll notice next year that projection on the far right-hand side, it's slightly down, but what you can also see by this graph is that we're not having changes that are wildly increased or decreased. So while our enrollment people will talk about having fluctuations, which is normal in a school district, we're not seeing huge swings in either direction to have big budget impacts for us. The next slide, I think, is really important because, you know, I've only lived here since December, but I certainly am aware that when people talk about school districts that they want to compare us to, it's Southern Fairfield County. And when you look at Southern Fairfield County, what you see with Fairfield on that far left-hand side is that we are being extremely prudent in our per-student spending in comparison to our colleagues in and around us. We are doing more with less. And I just think this is a good slide as a reminder. And Karen, if you could just click one more time. One more. Down on the very bottom, you'll see that if we were funded just at the average of all of Fairfield County, our budget would be almost $22 million more. And if we were talking about reductions, it would be a little bit easier if we had that $22 million in our budget and compared to other Southern Fairfield County school districts. So what are the budget drivers this year? The first budget driver is that we have a very large fifth grade that is leaving our elementary, but it's moving to middle school. So while we will have an enrollment shift at the elementary, and you'll see that in how we're staffing next year, we have enrollment increase in sixth grade, which means we're going to need additional staff there. So we have some staff changes that will be taking place within the budget. When we started calculating the staff for FY18, we utilized the Malone and McBroom projections, which was important because we don't just kind of come up with our own internal projections. We hire consultants who help us do that. We are having an elementary classroom reduction of 13 certified positions. And again, if you go back and look at what's happening in fifth grade, greatly attributed to that. We are also seeing a middle school increase of 8.4 certified. And again, that goes back to that slide where you're seeing some shifts and adjustments. We have a high school increase of 4.35 certified staff. We also have district special education behavioral support, an increase of 2 positions, and these positions work across the district, pre-K through 12. And when we sum that at the bottom, you're looking at an increase in certified of 1.55, non-certified is a reduction of 8.1, and combined, that's a reduction in positions this year of 6.55. And those are full-time equivalent positions. This is probably, I would say, one of the more important slides in our budget this year because, quite frankly, it is one of those slides that keeps us up at night. We know that there have been a lot of questions about how we calculate our retirees. So this year, we have used a new methodology. We've analyzed 9 years of data, and what that means is we've looked at what are the ages when people are retirement eligible, and it's 55 and older. Then we've gone in and we've looked at, between those age ranges, what is the percentage of somebody who is 56 that will actually retire? What is the percentage of somebody who is 62? We've looked at that over 9 years of data, and then we've applied those percentages to our current staff. So it is new methodology. We are very hopeful that it is going to work for us this year, but we also didn't anticipate a governor's budget that could scare people and make people nervous about what's happening with retirement in and around the state. We have calculated 23 retirees, and when you look at that, that's $828,000, and that's not in our budget. And the $36,000 is necessary, and what that means is that when we lose a teacher who is a higher paid teacher on the scale, well, you still need another teacher. But there's some cost savings there because usually it is a teacher who is younger in the system and lower on the scale. So the average savings with a retiree is $36,000. So that's where that number comes from. Also, another fixed cost for us is our health insurance. And the total increase needed for this next school year is $1.9 million. And that's a 10% increase. But I think it's important to note that while the line item is increasing 10%, that is not the increase to our health insurance rate. Our health insurance rate is 7%. And we made a big decision last year to switch health plans, and we were very happy that we did that and feel like the rate is good. But this year, as a reminder, in the 16-17 budget, we have $740,000 that was not funded through the regular town flow, and it was actually funded by the Medical Retention Reserve. So when we started out this year, we needed to make up that $740,000 that's already a current expense. It's not a new expense. So that's why you see that line item a little bit larger than we would like for it to be. And that total increase at $1.9 million when you look in the budget book. So when you look at the cost drivers as a whole, we have 6 of them. The first one is contracted salary increases. That number is right at $2.7 million. The increase to health insurance we just spoke about. We have the pension and retirement increase, which is just over $300,000. We have an increase to physical therapy and also to student services that is just under $400,000. We have transportation contracted increase, which is $255,000. Then we also have a magnet and special needs tuition increase at $437,000. And what you'll see is our fixed cost alone this year was $6 million in those 6 items. And when we first calculated this, especially the senior staff, we knew that this was going to be a difficult budget year in the state of Connecticut. So we worked incredibly hard to bring a budget to our Board of Education that actually reduced $1 million out of the budget to cover those fixed costs when we brought that to the Board of Education. And so our proposed increase is actually just right around $1 million less than just our fixed cost. These 3 items are where a majority of that million obviously came from. We started out by looking at where can we make some reductions to cover these fixed costs, capital, operations and maintenance of buildings, and then supplies, techs, and material. That's a big area for us. Many of you will remember that at the end of last year, we pre-purchased some textbooks for about $440,000. That's why you'll see that reduction here, and I know some of you have already asked about, well, where will we see that in the budget? And it's there if you look under that supplies, techs, and materials. This next slide is just a reminder that our budget is a needs-based budget. When we do all sit down from September through January, we don't ask about wants. We really are talking about what do we need to sustain a great school system. And this year, our headmasters, principals, senior leadership, our initial budget request, after we had already done several months of work, was still $2.2 million higher than what I proposed as the superintendent and then what the board has essentially put forward. When you look at the Board of Education proposed budget at a glance, what you'll see on the top are where you'll see some of those increases because that's where those fixed costs are sitting. When you look down on the bottom, in those areas that are bold, those last three areas, those are the ones we just talked about where you see more of the reductions, because those are the areas where we have more control. Now, our budget as a whole is at 3.12% increase. However, you have to remember, and Karen, if you can just click one more for me, one more, that truly this budget is a 2.7% increase. And that is because, if you click one more time for me, thanks. Now you're okay. And one more. And one more. And right at the top, remember we have that 740,000. So that's no new spending for us. That's just covering our existing expense. And this budget is really at 2.7. Now, we would be remiss to not mention the governor's budget and then also the first selectman's budget. If the first selectman's recommended reductions and the governor's reductions should occur for our budget, we will see an impact of 4.2 to 6.3 million to this existing Board of Education proposed budget tonight. And we want to show you what we mean by that, because a lot of this has not been out in the public from the school side. So we have a proposed budget of $168 million, which again is $1 million less than just to cover our fixed cost. We know that the first selectman has been dealing with a challenging budget on the town side. He made a recommendation to reduce that by $2 million. But we also have an excess cost reduction from our Board of Education funding, and this is special education funding. And the reduction to that is $3.3 million. And the DDS residential placement funding, these are students who actually live in residential placements. This funding is not showing up in the paper. It's really not showing up anywhere right now, because the way that the DDS has worked, it's basically another government agency paid for the residential component when a student needed their services in a residential school. We still paid for the educational cost, but the residential cost, the invoice, went somewhere else. So it's not in our budget, it's not in the town's budget, but they have let us know that the invoice will show up to us next year. That's what we believe is happening right now. In excess cost, that 3.3 million, if you think of that as a separate bank account from that 168, a lot of people in the state think that excess cost is just rolled into that 168, but that's not how it's handled. So if in fact we lose excess cost directly to the Board of Education and we lose the residential, the reduction that we're talking about tonight is 6.3 million to this Board of Education budget. Staggering, and it's scary. If the new special education grant that the governor has proposed flows directly to the Board of Education, so that would mean that 168 million is funded through town funding, but the special education grant flows directly to the Board of Education, then we're talking about 4.2 million. But it's still it's a large number, an incredibly challenging number for a school district who put forward a very responsible budget to then go and reduce another 4.2 million or 6.3. And there are some immediate future dates, just to remind the community. The Board of Selectmen meeting on the 28th. We also will be back in front of the Board of Finance on the 30th. We have RTM budget meetings in April, and then again, the RTM budget vote is scheduled for May 1st, but as we heard earlier tonight, some of these dates, especially that one, could change if the governor has a proposal that in fact changes some of this process for us. So thank you very much. I wish it was happier news. We do understand it's a very challenging budget this year.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Much appreciated. Just as a point of reference, and I do this only for full disclosure purposes, the one number that wasn't discussed up there is a very large number that the governor wants to pass back to the town.
Right.
After not funding a liability for teachers' pension for generations, the state now wants to pass back at least 30% of that cost for our teachers to the town of Fairfield. So that number is a $9 million number that we're waiting on additional information for, and what we're wrestling with and drove some of the decisions that we're
Right.
talking about tonight. Any questions, comments from colleagues before I open it up? On the presentation itself? On the presentation itself?
Do we have a copy of it for those ones?
Oh, I've got them.
Can we get a copy of it?
Yep.
Thank you. What I want to do now, and we've done this in years past, is, and if there's no objections, is turn to page 29 in the Distributed Board of Education Budget Book, which is the executive summary. And this I always refer to this as the Wally Flynn report. Back when I was a newbie on the Board of Finance, the much handsomer and more intelligent Mr. Flynn would say the only page you need to look at in this budget book is this one. And this lays out the costing by expense category. And since that time, I've always found that that's the best way to start looking at this budget, and we can go into the detail from there. Does anybody have any objections to that? Yes.
The question I have is, will we go to page 21 as well, when we talk about the revenue?
Absolutely. So would we like to go to 21 first and talk about that a little bit, and then we'll go to page 29? So, Dr. Jones, this revenue page was done prior to the governor's proposal, is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
So this includes the educational cost sharing, but does not include the special education grant that he's proposing, correct?
The special education grant is not showing up
Right.
for us in what the governor has proposed.
Okay, it'll show up on the town side.
Yeah, what the governor has done, initially in his presentation, he included that $2 million as an increase to municipal aid.
Right.
In our discussions with the Board of Ed, it seems both fair and appropriate, and we've committed on the town side that however that money gets here, whether it goes directly to the Board of Ed or comes to the town side first, we would pass that over to the Board of Ed so they can count on getting whatever that special ed allotment eventually is.
Right. Which is why you're saying that the total cost, if all things being equal, the total adjustment is netted at 4.2, right? And then the other thing, do we have confirmation on that $1 million that you're told you're going to get the bill for? Is that in fact happening?
I would say it's, if you can think about it, just like you think about retirement, it's kind of in that same category, in that it's very difficult right now to get affirmative answers on anything. They did give us a formal letter, and I believe it was December, that was pretty clear that that is the way it will work next year.
Thank you for that.
You're
You
welcome.
did disclose that at our quarterly meeting, as I recall. Okay. Any questions on page 21, now that we put it into context? Okay. Seeing none, let's flip to page 29.
I guess, can I interrupt for a second?
You absolutely can.
There's been a lot of discussion about open choice, and I see the revenue. Can you just walk us through that, the actual versus the projected, and what you're anticipating for next year?
We have 72 open choice in the budget for FY18, and those are existing students, and that calculation is at $3,000 per student.
Questions? Mr. Walsh?
We'd asked a couple of weeks ago for you guys to provide us with a detail of the breakout of the costs for those open space children,
Open choice.
open choice, excuse me. And to date, we've yet to see anything. Is there a delay in that for some reason?
I wouldn't say that there's a delay, but you've asked two questions that I think are valuable questions. One of them had to do with special education tuition. One of them has to do with open choice. they've both been a struggle for us in dealing, number one, with FERPA, making sure what we put out, because it's small numbers of children at specific schools or specific school sites. And it's a struggle in that we know we get $3,000 per student, and then we look at where have we had to add sections over time, and so we have studied that, and I wouldn't say that tonight we're ready to give that to you in any letter of detail, other than we know that $3,000 per student is very concrete. However, I believe, and I know Mr. Dwyer could speak to this because I think we were just talking about it today, they have made a reduction in open choice funding, so we'll be watching that as well at the state.
Could you
level.
speak to the reduction, and then I want to come back, well, before you do that, what's the time frame I'm getting the information? So you just said we're not prepared to talk about it tonight. We vote in a month, less than a month? What's the time frame?
My anticipation would be when we're in front of you the next time, which is, sorry, I'd have to look at that, between now and then to try to get you as many answers as we can. The special education one was another question that we have pulled a lot of data based off the question that you ask. And what I can tell you is that we have 19 to 20 different schools that we work with. I can tell you that the range of, we went and pulled all the tuition. The range of the tuition is from $20,000 to $379,000 for one student, and the average is $118,000. So we have the detail for you. It's been difficult for us to figure out how to put something like that on paper where it's not identifiable for students.
Great.
Yeah.
I can understand that, but we would like to get whatever you can come up with
Yeah.
well before we vote, if we could.
And I think, Mr. Walsh, you asked for multiple years study of the open choice. And so every time you'd have to do multiple years, there's a lot of research and archive information that you have to kind of pull out. So it's just taking a little bit longer, that's all.
Can you address the comment that Dr. Jones made about the open choice funding, and then I'll turn it back over to Mr. Walsh?
And looking at the governor's budget, I noted that the open choice program has a budget reduction. Normally, by this time, CES has asked us for what open slots you may have in the following school year. They have not asked us yet. So I suspect that CES, like all boards of education around the state, are in a what if and what will actually happen scenario. So that is the governor's proposal. I don't remember the exact number, but whether the legislature adopts that or increases that, it's just an open question that I think will be similar to the pension cost and a lot of other issues.
How big a reduction was it, do you recall?
To the best of my knowledge, it was about $10 million.
What's that as a percentage? I'm sorry.
Don't know.
You don't know?
What was it last year?
I don't know.
How can we know that number? It's a very easy number to look up, right? I mean, we looked it up, we knew it was enough that it was reduced. We don't know what it was reduced from.
I was glancing through his budget message as to where his reductions were. I wasn't doing a full study of the state budget.
All right. Can we get that number tomorrow morning? Should be a pretty easy number to get, right?
If in fact it is an easy number to get,
Yeah.
then yes. If it's not, then I just don't know.
Is this one of the numbers that the governor's kind of trying to play Robin Hood with, where we might get less than, it might not be divided by the number of students? You know, he considers Fairfield to be an extremely wealthy community. And is this one of those numbers where we might get 0 per student?
Don't know. We can probably call CES, because I'm sure they follow it closer than we do, because they're the ones who manage that process. There are 7 RESCs around the state. CES is the Regional Education CS Service Center for our part of the state. So we could call them and see if they have more updated information.
Can I ask, am I okay, Mr. Matola? Yeah, go ahead. I assume then that the administration/Board of Education is not going to give the state any student numbers until such time as we know what the financial implication is. Is that correct?
Oh, you mean until we look at those last several years of,
No, until, so you've just made a statement that it looks as though the state is revisiting the amount that they're going to give to open choice. The follow-up to that was that we don't know how that might impact us because we're, as Mr. Walsh said, generally considered a wealthy community in somebody's playbook. So that being the case, how can we commit to a number of open choice students other than those that are already in the district that I guess you have no choice but to keep in the district? But how can you commit to any changes to that program without knowing what the financial impact to the taxpayer is because the state hasn't determined it yet?
All we provide to them early on is if there are any open slots that have at least like a 4-student margin before it creates another section.
Okay, so is the answer to that, before we have any information, there are no open slots until we know how much you're going to pay us for it?
And so I would imagine that we could say, here are the open slots, but if you find that you're not going to give us the $3,000 per student because we're on the tail end of some list, then we would not accept those students.
Okay.
Are they able to change the amount per student that currently are here? Enrolled in our, and
I don't believe so, but
Or
no,
they
this is a year of uncharted territory.
Okay,
So
does anybody else have the answer to that question? Are they able to change the dollar amount per these enrolled children in the open choice program?
The funding piece, the 3,000,
How much we get per student?
this year, they can do just about anything, I would say.
So are
I
we allowed
can't
to,
answer
if,
that.
say the number's not high enough, are we allowed, or you guys allowed to then say we're not going to enroll 72 students? We might enroll 0 of those students. And maybe those students can go back to communities that are getting a lot higher percentage of the education dollars.
I think this is a big discussion for the Board of Ed. What I would say is that I want to just caution us that we're not talking about a program, or when we say open choice, we're talking about children. And these are children that have been with us in Fairfield, and they're part of our community and part of our school. And they've been with us, some of these children, for a decade. And we're talking about real children. And so I want to be mindful of that. And where we also have a racial imbalance plan that has been presented to the state, they have approved open choice as part of that plan. So what does that mean to the Board of Ed to say? And what financially does that mean on a different side, to say we're also going to ignore the state law in racial imbalance and not do what we said we were going to do in the plan? So it's a much more complex issue than I think we can just answer here tonight. And I mean, we did not foresee what was going to be happening, I don't think. I knew it was going to be a difficult budget year, maybe because I'm naive and new to Connecticut. I certainly didn't expect the governor to have a budget of the magnitude that he has and impact Fairfield. So this is a big issue.
Mr. Mottola, you had a follow-up, and then I'll go back to Mr. Walsh.
So that, we have 72 open choice students in the district right now, correct?
Correct.
We're getting $3,000, and we're not sure whether or not that number's going to change, whether the state's going to say we're going to give you $2,000 for each of these students. It's just uncertain at this time, correct?
I would say anything with school funding right now, at least from where we're sitting, is uncertain.
Okay. All right, that's what I need to know right now. Thanks.
Mr. Walsh, I'll go back to you.
That's all I have for right now.
Mr. Becker.
And just to be clear, you guys have submitted on the racial imbalance plan more open choice seats in the future? Is that's part of that?
It is
right?
part of the plan.
So I think what seems to be happening here, a couple of things, right? So they've got a racial imbalance law that's in place that, and then you have a district like ours that they know has open seats. You look at the declining enrollment, you look at what we're doing with adding seats at schools, essentially building out the 504s. I think one of the concerns, I don't have a concern so much as, I mean, there's obviously the history and understanding those costs, but I get it. If a student's here, and there's sort of the financial side, and there's also the human doing the right thing side. What concerns me, though, is that next step, where we're continuing to follow the state and all of the laws that they want to put in, or even their reading of those laws, which seem to be very much not fitting with Fairfield and what we're trying to do, the neighborhood schools and the population liking McKinley, all that. And I think that's a concern. And I think the other side is now they're going to start stripping out funding. So now you've got sort of this bullseye on your back for all of your funding. Now they're talking about doing that for the open choice side, yet we're over here saying the argument or not, we tell them we have 0 slots or whatever. We have a racial imbalance plan that's up there that's talking about adding more. So you kind of can't say, no, we don't have any seats, because we're going to their other board saying, you know, we're openly going to be taking more students to try to fix this other issue. So I think it would be helpful, you know, for the Board of Ed to start. I mean, I think this came up at I believe at the quarterly, when you were last here. I think it's come up maybe some under the Holland Hill. It's coming up again tonight. So I think it would be helpful for the Board of Education. I don't know if you're going to accomplish this between now and, you know, on our voting, but to get back about kind of how all that interconnects and what the real plan is for Fairfield, and whether it may very well be, you know what, we're gonna challenge other aspects of the racial imbalance plan instead of simply going back and just continuing doing what they want. Because what seems like what they want is to push as many students as they possibly can, for whatever reason they can, with the least amount of funding that they possibly can for those students. And remember that it's not just the 3,000, because when they strip out all these other dollars, these students are part of that bigger pie and that bigger number, the overall BOE count that we have. And that number ticking up over the 72 starts to become a bigger percentage. So I think if you're not going to be able to answer it probably much tonight, you can certainly summarize your sort of take on what I've said, but I think it would be helpful, you know, for you guys to take that look and then to be able to come back, you know, to this board with that other part of the equation, because I think there's a lot going on, and Fairfield's just continually getting whacked by them. And at some point, I alluded to this earlier when it came to the mandates. You know, there's the mandates that maybe we don't need to be doing, or, you know, different processes. There's also the human ones that you're just going to do. But this is part of that conversation, and us at some point as a town, you know, just standing up for ourselves. So that's my take. And get
Mr.
back.
Mottola.
So just since somebody mentioned the racial imbalance plan, is part of your plan, if I'm understanding it correctly, is to increase the number of open choice students for this coming year?
In the plan, it is 18. That's in that
18 additional.
additional.
Okay.
We're not budgeting for it.
Right.
We're not budgeting.
Yeah,
for
we're
that.
budgeting for last year's number, because we can ask for more slots, but if there are not more students who wish to come, you know, so we're planning on it but not budgeting for it, which I think is an appropriate way to budget,
Gotcha.
that you don't budget on income that you don't know that you're going to get.
You have to ask for the slots, and then hopefully the state will say okay, and they'll reimburse you.
And a family will say, yes, I want to choose Fairfield.
Okay, you're going back to the state pretty soon, right? On the plan, racial imbalance plan? Wasn't it like 120
April?
days from December?
May.
Okay. And just, I don't want to get into a huge discussion about this, and I'm going to ask maybe whether there's a budget impact. Why are you going back to the state, and what
The
does
state
the
had
state want
asked
from
us,
you?
yeah, the state accepted our plan, gave conditional approval to the plan. What they asked us for is a more definitive timetable on the action steps you'll take to move the study of a magnet program along, and to move the construction timetable for Holland Hill along, and to move the discussion on whether redistricting is a viable alternative as a last choice. And so we have added to the plan kind of a timetable that says, here are the steps we'll take to get us from here to there. And that's what they asked us for, so that they could keep track of it, measure our progress. So the plan is not changing, just the timetable has been added to it. Is that a fair?
Yes, that's
So
right.
would it be fair to say that for this coming fiscal year, there really isn't any budget impact associated with the racial imbalance plan?
Unless
Is that,
Choices.
well, but 18 people, I think he just said that.
They didn't budget for it.
Yeah, we
They
haven't
budget
budgeted
for
for it.
We're hope the states
Yeah, if we don't get them,
reimburse us, hopefully.
yeah, if we don't get them, we've not lost revenue that we counted on.
Right.
No, but we might have increased expense
If we don't get them, we won't have increased expense.
if we don't get them. So, well, that's my earlier point. Do we take anybody if we don't know what the state's going to do? I, forget about the
I don't
72.
believe we
I agree
do.
with that.
I don't
Right.
believe we do, no.
Right.
If the state changes the rules, then we'd have to change the rules on our side.
That's my point.
Would that affect, if you don't take them, doesn't that negatively affect your racial imbalance plan to a certain degree?
That's something we'd have to deal with the State Board of Education.
That wouldn't be your fault, so.
Correct. You may realize that the governor puts out his budget proposal, and the State Board of Education has some engagement with that, but they didn't necessarily know exactly what line items were being cut.
Right.
And so, the State
They're
Board
in
of
the
Education...
same position you are.
Yeah, yeah. So, if that happens, then they'll probably say, so what's Plan B?
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions on this topic? Mr. Becker, is
just
it
go
on this
back.
topic?
Yeah, I mean, so just to understand the racial imbalance proposals, though, in reading that a little bit more, it seems as though you may do all these open choice things and then and some other steps and still end up at redistricting. I mean, that they seem to be wanting to push it to do all your construction and then do some big redistricting, as if you're going to do all these different steps to try to avoid it, and you're still going to end up in that. So you're going to spend all the money and then end up doing something that A, is expensive, and B, nobody wants.
So the state, for the last 7 years, redistricting has been their preferred solution. For the last 7 years, the town of Fairfield, the Fairfield Public Schools have pushed back on that and said, at the last meeting, we said, that's the nuclear option. That is the last thing this district wants to do. And so we're going to look at every voluntary effort we can find to cause people on a voluntary basis to pick a school that helps us stay under that 25%. So our board is committed to being as creative as humanly possible. But the state, if they feel that we are not even looking at redistricting, it would be like Mr. Flynn saying, could you look at this? And I said, Mr. Flynn, no, I'm not gonna. Then you'd get a little peeved, right? So the state expects us to at least address the question. But nobody in this room or listening on the TV audience should believe that the Board of Education wants to seriously go down that route. We want to find other alternatives to meet the state requirement.
Good, thank you.
Mr. DeWitt? You want to go back? Is there any other comment on this topic or on page 21 as a whole? Seeing none, if you have a question on the presentation, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Jones. I'd like a couple questions about your budget drivers, which I appreciate you adding in here. Largest fifth grade moving to the middle school. Is this, and I don't mean to make this sound simple because I know it's not, but is this literally a redistribution of teachers? Some teachers will leave our elementary schools and move to the middle schools?
Yes, I mean, what we hope is through natural attrition, because when you look at that slide just below that one, where it actually breaks it apart, so where you see, for instance, 13 reductions at elementary.
Right.
We could have a teacher who chooses to move to middle school because they're certified for sixth grade and able to do that. We also could have a teacher who is having a baby and decides not to return, so some of those will be natural attrition. And it's a combination, anytime you have a shift and a change like this.
Right, okay. So on your next slide, good segue. Your bottom line is 6.55 reduction
That's correct.
which actually, I think the math's wrong, but I got 6.45, doesn't matter. It's 7, right? Does this imply that from last year to this year's budget, there are 6.5 less full-time
Equivalent.
equivalent? Right,
Yes.
okay. That
That's
doesn't
correct.
necessarily equate to 6 people. I mean, it equates to full-time equivalents, which can be covered with half-time and,
That's
Correct?
correct. In any school district, you have full-time equivalent, and then you also have people, where you're just counting heads. Because you may have a teacher who only works for us 4 hours a day, or you could have a teacher who's half-time. And those are when you say FTE, full-time equivalent, you're calculating what is equal to a full-time teacher.
right, got it. On the number of retirees, can you remind me what's in this year's budget?
In 18?
18, okay. 23, as I recollected, seemed high. And I appreciate your explanation that now you've taken a 9-year average. And I've been on this board 10 years and remember hearing that number. And it's a crapshoot every year, and I appreciate that. Because there were years in the 2008, the financial tough times, where we saw less teachers leaving because they decided it was in their financial benefit to stay on an extra year or 2 years, right? So I guess my question is it better to budget higher than lower? Because these, as you pointed out, $828,000 of teacher salaries are not in the budget, and that 23 seems like a really high number to me.
The 23 is based off of a model, and there's a methodology behind it. Is it a scary number? Sure. Because if we don't get 23 retirements, we must find that funding somewhere. But we felt as though we were asked to apply a methodology and look at this issue at a deeper level, so we did that. The board had some discussion when the night that we approved the budget about should we have a contingency somewhere to hire one or two teachers, or 3 or 4, because we have brought an extremely lean budget this year, and I can't express that enough because of things like this.
I think this is the first year in my memory that somebody at the Board of Finance has asked if we've been too aggressive in the number of retirees.
No, I don't think that's
So-
true.
So no, because this has always been a topic, and are we budgeting enough? Because every year it seems what we budget, we always exceed.
Well, what was interesting about that, thanks for bringing that up. What was interesting about that was there was a newspaper article, I think, in the early fall that quoted a much higher number than of kind of movement, staff turnover. It was actually really surprising. And I asked a question about that at a quarterly review meeting that I never did get an answer to. But
And I did answer that question for somebody, and that
for
reached
me.
out, and so I apologize if it wasn't you.
because
But
Mr. and Tetra and I both had we both read the same article and actually talked to each other that morning.
and it may have been
said-
Mr. Tetro and I that talked about that number, actually.
It was
Yes.
a Fairfield Citizen article last August, and it talked about the last 3, 4, 5 years of turnover in the 65 to 70 range, and I think that's, between that and the 23 numbers, what created the interest.
Right, and what they were talking about in that article is just turnover of teachers. So if we have 50 people who decide to move all over the United States and take different jobs, we still have to replace those teachers. And that article was focused more on the teacher training aspect, bringing in new employees, looking at that aspect. It wasn't based off just the
But
retirees.
there's no savings there.
Not necessarily. I mean, we can have a teacher who's a 10-year teacher who leaves, and you can hire a 15-year teacher or a 12-year, and then it actually can cost a little bit more. That's why we have an average that we use to budget for teachers.
Right.
And we know on average, it's around $75,000 is what we budget.
Okay.
And that's with all of the in and out.
Thank you. Any other questions
Just
on our
my-
presentation? Go right ahead.
One more for me. Your proposed budget trims, textbooks, I understand the textbooks, and I had some experience in previous years with the better to buy $800,000 worth of books when they're cheaper than wait, so I'm kind of okay with that. I would have expected to see maybe operations and maintenance and capital be a little bit higher numbers. But, I mean, I leave it to your best judgment. But I guess, as is a popular term around here lately, these are just kicking the can, right? This is not stuff that's going to go away. These capital investments are things that, if we don't buy them this year, it's next year. This is cost avoidance for a particular year, correct?
I would say that that is correct, and I would also refer you back to the quarterly review that we just had, because, that's where we are taking existing projects from this school year and putting some of those on hold, as well as now we're talking about things that we wanted to do next year that we're not going to be able to do.
Your segues are unbelievable for me tonight. So that's my last question. How much from this year, we know we're asking you, how much from this year's budget made it in, the current budget that you're executing as the kicking the can down the road, made it into this budget? Does that make any sense?
Are you talking about from when staff worked on the budget until the superintendent presented the budget to the board and then the board to you, or
No.
at what point in time?
So at some point in this fiscal year, we realized that, and I forget the number we're at, it was around about $1 million shortfall, give or take, right? Did any of that shortfall that you're desperately trying to minimize to zero make it into here? Because I'm assuming there must be some maintenance or capital kind of things.
And I would say no, and Mr. Cullen is agreeing. And part of that, you have to think about the timing of the budget as well. So we're dealing with two budgets at the same time. And
Right, yeah,
right. So
okay.
Well, Mr. Cullen might put his projects forward in October and November,
Yep.
and then in December and January, when we have to cut from the budget, he's already put his next year's,
So Mr. Cullen is smart enough to do his work up front so that he can't take the money away because he already spent it, which is very smart on his part. I mean that as a compliment. That's great. I appreciate it. Thank you.
there are
Mrs. Marmion,
capital
and then we'll
projects
go to
every
Mr.
year
Mottola.
that we hold back on until we know how the year is going.
Right.
Go
Got
to
it.
Mrs. Marmion and then Mr. Mottola.
Thank you. I just have a question on the supplies, text, and materials, the reduction, the trims, the expenses. When you look at curriculum, review your curriculum for next year, I'm assuming this was taken into account because I know sometimes we have changes in textbooks, et cetera, but can you comment on whether or not any curriculum decisions are going to be affected in terms of what you're reviewing for changes for next year based on this cut?
based on the proposed budget that's before you, that's the Board of Education budget, is very different. When you say cut, I just want to make sure you're not talking about the first selectmen's budget, because that's a different discussion. Yeah.
This budget here.
The existing budget, we did freeze some things. For instance, we were going to implement another year of foreign language in elementary. That is not in this budget. We were going to implement science curriculum at the high school, and materials, that was taken out of the budget. So there are a list of things that we've made choices about in putting the budget together for this year that are not reflected in here.
And I'm assuming that, given these newest cuts, you'll have further discussion in terms of what might need to be further frozen, or whatever the term is.
I'm going to be very optimistic and hope that the Board of Education budget is supported in what's been presented, because it is so lean, which still means we would be dealing with that other $2 million in reduction. If we are dealing with over $4 million, it is going to touch every aspect of the school division, and I couldn't be, honest and sit here and say, oh, it's not going to, everything be fine. It is going to touch every area. Of course, curriculum will be one of those areas.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Mr. Mottola?
On page 6 of your presentation, the health insurance, the cost drivers, can you, I don't know if you can or not, can you explain how the 7% increase, what's attributed to that? Do you get that information from Aon? Do they still?
Yeah, I'll let Ms. Munsell.
Yes, that was an AON recommendation.
And that's just based on the premium that you're paying. It's an increase in the premium that you're paying. Is that correct? Because you're under a whole new plan this
The Connecticut Partnership Plan 2.0, yes.
All right. If you had stayed on the old plan, do you have the number, what the increase would have been? Would it have been less, more? Do you have any idea?
Well, the old plan was based on claims,
I understand.
and I think the last time Aon looked at it, actually, there's a page in the book, I think it was 1.2 or $2 million more.
Then the 1.9 here?
Correct.
So you have saved some money by switching over. Right, that's it, thank you.
In regards to that, Mr. Mayor, you were just addressing that issue, though. Based on their claims level, they would have been about the same, right?
Two comments. One, the 7% that's in there is a guess at this time. The state doesn't issue their premiums for next year until April. So that 7% is another placeholder, if you will. Second part of your question is, based upon the last analysis by Aon, the claims experience is approximately equal to the premium. So we're saving money over last year, but the savings aren't coming from being in the state point two. Would have saved it anyway. But the other side of that is there's still 6 months to go of experience to look at.
Right.
On any other numbers that we talked about this evening, can you point out to me when we're going through whether this is a real number or whether this is kind of a guess of a number? The 7% seems to be a guess, right? Estimated?
Yeah, I'm call it a swag rather than a wag.
I would just
You know
like
what
to
the
kind
S stands for in that, right?
Scientific.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's not what I've heard it stood for. Okay. Good.
But as we're going through, if you can point that out,
Sure.
only because when I'm seeing 7%, I presume that you'd gotten the claims, whatever the increase was going to be, and,
No, we won't get the rates until the spring.
okay.
Could be lower, could be higher, right?
Yeah.
Just don't know.
A
Correct.
few more months of experience.
Doubt it would be higher.
Okay.
It could conceivably be lower based upon, looking at the track record in the state. But we won't know until.
Mr. Walsh, did you have another question?
I have another question, maybe you can explain to me. You've listed and the total, like on page 29, the total proposed budget's 168, 757, $490. Correct?
The original budget proposed by the Board of Ed in January, yes.
Yes. And then I see that in the budget book, the First Selectman's taken that $2,033,000 off of that, correct? But on page 21 and 22, you receive revenue that you don't reduce that by. You get that revenue in and you spend it? Is that additional spending as well when we get that revenue?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So what is the total amount of your budget that you plan on spending? Is that any place in the book?
Well, the revenue on page 22,
Okay.
$8.9 million.
How much?
8.9, there's a new page, the Board of Ed,
So it's
is 8.4,
The 8.4?
yeah.
Okay.
But
So it's 8.4.
that's total revenue. To the board, it's 7.3.
The difference being the ECS grant that actually we put in the book for information purposes, but that money actually goes to used to go to the town.
So the total spending is 176, about 176 million if I add the 7 plus the 68. Is that
If
right?
you say that the original book
The original.
has 168 million plus the 7.3, correct?
Right.
Add those two numbers together, and that was the original Board of Ed proposed. When you're dealing with state grants, you keep them separate, you charge the appropriate expenses against that grant, and then report the revenue and the expense to the state at the end of the grant period.
Right. Yep.
So where why wouldn't you do on page 29 that, the total spending, then, when you break it out by salaries, benefits, everything? With the additional funds that you would get from other sources?
The expenses related to the state grants are captured in pages 23 and on. And so if we included those expenses in the Fairfield tax pages,
Yeah.
you know, these things, you'd be double counting the expenses. The only other answer I have is, that's because this is the way we've always shown it.
Okay, so you don't do like a pie chart or anything showing all the money that you have, on all the spending you get, whatever the sources, whether it comes from the town, whether
Haven't
it
in
comes
the
from the
past.
federal government, whether it comes from the state, or whether it comes from any other source. You don't split that out.
Have not in the past, no.
Okay, when you give your per pupil expenditure, do you take into account the money that we get from the state, the federal government?
Yeah, that's from, that's what we report to the state. Those are all financial reporting mechanisms that go to the state, and they do include all sources of funding.
No, the number on this, the number on your presentation, because I did the math, is based off the 168. So on the chart that showed where we stood relative to the other towns and per pupil spending, it comes with the 16,561.
Yep.
Unless I miscalculated, that's simply the 168,757 divided by the total number of students that was on the other pie chart, or not pie chart, graph. I'm terrible at those things. 9,800 and some odd. So it doesn't include all sources of funding. It includes the local tax sources of funding, based on the explanation we just got.
No. All per pupil expenditures that the state reports include all sources of funding. So
Okay, but I'm just saying, in this presentation, in this deck,
Page 4.
right?
Yep.
Thank you.
Page 4, top slide.
Where it says 16,561 per pupil. That number, you multiply that by the number of
Can
students.
I interrupt you for one moment, Mr.
Comes
Fenn?
out to the 168. Yeah.
That 16 is a 2015-16 number, because that's the last year the state calculated.
Okay, so that works,
So
though.
you'd have to kind of, they're very close, but the state does capture all of the information on expenditures and revenue, puts it
I
through
get
their
it.
formula, and produces the number.
No, I get it. I'm just doing the math on this one, that's all. Comes out this, yeah. Got it. It comes out to this year's estimated actual, 1617. Comes out to the same number.
They're generally pretty close.
Okay, but that doesn't include all sources of funding in this analysis. Okay. Other questions on the presentation? Mr. DeWitt?
I know we're going to talk about transportation later, but one of your fixed cost drivers, transportation contracted cost increase. We are not in a negotiation year for transportation, correct? That's next year, I think. So what's driving that $250,000?
We do have a 2.5% increase in our contract for FY18.
Oh, contractual.
That's
So,
correct.
but we knew that, right? That isn't, I mean, we knew that was coming.
Right, that's correct.
You're just saying as a percentage, as a number, it's one of the bigger numbers that's driving the fixed cost?
It's
Hence
one
the
of-
reason it's fixed, because you can't, because it's
Right,
contractual?
we must pay it.
Got it. Thank you.
Other questions
Any questions, General?
on the presentation?
On the presentation, you talked about the governor's proposal that we have to pay, I think it was room and board on tuitions, the $1 million that we might have to pay, that you said is not being talked about in the press at all?
It's really not in the governor's budget. It was a decision that was made, and I believe, and correct me if I'm incorrect, but from the Attorney General, the state Attorney General, that did weigh in on a decision that our students who are in a residential placement, which means that they're students who have significant needs, they need to live at their school. In the past, we have paid the educational costs for that student, and the Department of Developmental Services has paid for the actual residential component. But what is happening now is that they are saying that that entire cost will come to the school division. And we estimate, and again, it's one of those numbers, it can change from year to year depending on how many students are actually in residential. So we've looked at exactly which students we have right now and what we estimate that cost to be, and we expect it to be right around $1 million. It could be $1.4 million, could be $1.2 million, and it could be $850,000. We're expecting it to be around $1 million.
Depending on what happens with the change in population, right?
That's correct, yes.
I know you've looked at, in the past, taking some special education services and bringing them in-house and developing expertise in-house to try to reduce the number. With this extra $1 million to $1.4 million, will you look at whether it makes more sense to hire the proper personnel to bring some of these services in for some of these students to keep them in-house to see whether it's more financially beneficial to do that? Because it's a lot of money.
Well, and I will say on this 1 million, this component, the needs are significant enough, we could not, we couldn't service those needs here in the school division.
Okay.
Other questions? Go ahead, Mrs. Leclerc.
So the Board of Ed is responsible for education. So how does that come under our education budget, the residential piece to it? Like, it kind of makes sense to me why it was split in prior years. Do you have any understanding of the new interpretation?
No, and I don't know if Ms. Leonardi has any detail to that. We'll ask if she has more to that.
Good evening. This particular issue is for students with significant disabilities who were placed by the Department of Developmental Services. The Attorney General, obviously the Department of Developmental Services is also under significant restriction due to the state budget crisis. So this year, DDS, the Department of Developmental Services, sought guidance from the Attorney General to determine whether or not students who had been placed by DDS in residential facilities because of the nature of their disability and in order to assist their families, whether or not DDS could stop funding their residential placements. And the Attorney General weighed in and said yes. And so DDS has sent a letter out to families saying you have X number of months to seek funding for that from your school districts, up to and including filing for a due process hearing to prove that the nature and extent of your child's disability requires residential treatment in order to receive a free and appropriate public education. That's the standard under IDEA. So there are students who we've placed residentially from the PPT process in district because we were unable to, without that 24/7 care, we were unable to appropriately educate them. These are not those students. These are students who DDS. We could have educated them here or in a day placement, but because of the nature of their disability, their home structures were insufficient to meet their very significant needs. And so DDS made placements for them over many years. Some of these students have been in residential placements since they were young children. And that's the push me, pull you of this DDS funding. In terms of residential placement for any child under IDEA, the standard is we have to reach a free and appropriate public education. And sometimes, for some students, that includes residential treatment.
Any other questions? Mrs. Leclerc? Mr. Brown, do you have a follow-up to that?
Yes, and while she's up there, something about special ed, or do you want to move on?
No, go, if it's a follow-up to that question.
Did every district get the same letter?
Yes.
Okay. The new program, though, you did set up a new program.
Yes.
ESS?
Yes.
Okay. How is that program working? Has that been able to save the district any money?
Yes, that program continues to provide a high level of therapeutic services to students in the high school who, as a result, do not need to be placed in either day treatment or residential treatment. And so there are currently 45 students receiving those services. I've done kind of a straw poll of the administration of the buildings. And, you know, they've given me information that without that service in the buildings right now, they would be looking at probably 12 additional day placements at least. I would tell you that there aren't 12 day placements available. We would be looking for some residential for those kids. So yes, we brought and created programming in-house for students who need that. We have examples of that all over the district. Our autism program is similar. It's not an inexpensive program for us as an in-district program, but it's significantly less expensive than it would be if all of those students were placed out.
Okay, so they're getting the care they need at less cost.
They're getting the care they need at less cost, yes.
All right, thank you.
All right, any other questions on the presentation?
On that, though, is that, just looking back, the pupil personnel services spike, that's what we're looking at there. So it was 968 back in 15-16, and it's jumped to a little over 2. So that's our work on that end, but we're
Yes.
saving in other places, essentially.
You're saving and not increasing the number of students in outplacements, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, let's finally get to page number 29. Okay, so staff salaries, you walked us through in your presentation, you're roughly flat on staffing?
Flat? No.
You're down a little on the non-certified, right? It's 6.55 down. Right?
Understanding that.
Correct. What's the total, when I say roughly flat, how many people work for you?
Yeah, it's 1,483, I believe. Actually, we have on contract 1,428.
Okay, so where's the 83 come from? Or
Where's
was
the
that
what?
just you just said 83?
I think it's the difference between, that's why I was just trying to double-check my numbers, difference between FTE and total employees. We have 1,488 total employees.
Okay, right.
Employees, so if you count their heads.
So like I said, 6.55, we're roughly flat, and this is the increase that's contractually required for all the different bargaining units at this
That's
point,
correct.
right? How long do those, so that we're in a new world order here with what's going on with the state. How long are we in these current contracts?
It varies by union, but the biggest one, which is the FEA, I think is up next year.
When you say up next year, so you're going to start
We
negotiating
do 3-year
soon?
contracts.
Right, so you're going to start negotiating soon to go into effect for 2019.
And on page 134, there's actually a list for you there, too.
Yeah, I saw that earlier, I was just wanted to make sure. Page 134, right?
That's correct. 134.
Wanted to make sure I was reading that right. Right, so,
So we'll start this fall to negotiate, and it'll be effective July 1, 18, I believe. is the
it
way you
looks
read
like
that.
all of them come up sooner rather than later, though, no? Right? I mean, they're all kind of in negotiations.
Yes.
With the exception of the special education teachers, which is another year out.
Settled, right?
The difference is that on certified staff, the state law has a very tight time frame that you have to settle the contract.
Right.
Whereas the non-certified, there is no time frame, so sometimes it takes us a couple of years to settle those contracts.
Right. Right. Understood. Thank you for pointing back out that page. I appreciate that. Any other questions on staff salaries or things of that? Questions, comments, anything on the staffing levels whatsoever? Okay. Let's go to benefits. This is largely the medical increase, correct?
That's correct.
And that's, what do we say that was, 1.8?
Increase to health insurance is 1.9.
1.9. What's the rest in here for? It's going up another few $100,000. Is that the other bargaining units, or what's
If you
that?
actually look on page 33,
Beautiful. Yep. Well, the pension is included in there as well, okay? Great. Questions on this?
Yes.
Go ahead, Mr. Walsh.
Why isn't the, since we're budgeting for the governor's pension portion increase of 9 million plus, why isn't that being included on the Board of Education side?
If I might, one, specifically with the book, because it was done long before the governor's presentation. Second, because that is one of the components of the governor's proposal that is the most highly discussed as probably going away. We felt it appropriate for this year to keep it on the town side. We could manage it from that standpoint. If that becomes a component in future years, then we might reconsider that.
By future years, meaning that if it passes the legislature as is, next year we would expect to see it on the Board of Education side?
If it passes the legislature in some form,
Whether
yeah,
reduced or the same form or whatever.
then I would expect that.
Then you would expect it to be on the Board of Education side?
Yeah. Given the, just the variability right now and where we are, it seems simpler for all of us to keep it on the town side so we know where it is. And with the fervent hope that it goes away.
Because if this were to pass the legislature and was on the Board of Education side, it would be a 5.4% increase.
Yeah, $9 million is a huge number, no matter which side it's on, and it's getting paid by tax dollars one way or the other. In the presentation that I did, we did, when I went back and looked at both the direct and indirect costs of the Board of Ed, their indirect expenses, we did include it in the 65% number.
And the other, I mean, just the real issue here, if you were to put it as part of the Board of Ed budget now, not knowing whether we're going to get it or not, hit with it, and then pass it, those funds are included in the Board of Ed budget, and they're not utilized by the town or whatever. And if we didn't get hit with the $9 million, they would still be sitting there under the management of the Board of Education.
It's the practical reality is once we vote, or once the RTM votes
Right.
on the Board of Ed number, that is the Board of Ed
It's a
number.
Right.
But with smaller numbers, when the electrical savings occurred to us of about $350,000 as a result of the town's purchasing department, we did not spend that money. We
I know you
returned that
wouldn't.
to the town. So I'm sure that we would be taking a similar attitude if that would have happened.
And,
The beauty of this is there's always another year, so what goes around comes around.
no, but the comment is both correct, and the Board of Ed has played fair, if you will. I don't mean to suggest otherwise in that. However, once it's in the Board of Ed budget and it can't be reduced, it then gets into the mill rate for that year. And if we didn't have a $9 million hit, it would be nice to have some flexibility to not include that in the mill rate.
Yep.
Do you have any idea how other towns are handling that and whether they're putting it as a Board of Education expense?
Mr. Tetro may have some idea on that. I don't.
I was at a CCM conference this morning with probably 70 or 80 representatives. I don't know if that was 70 or 80 towns. There were definitely 70 or 80 bodies in the room. That was a topic of discussion, and a number of towns are kind of asking for guidance from the state as where that should go. And because it covers, it's pretty simple with us, one town, one school district. Think of it as a regional school
Right.
district. You got 4 or 5 towns. Where does that number go when it's split between the towns and coming up? So there is no definitive answer on that at this point.
Thank you. All right, any other questions on benefits? Seeing none, let's go to instructional services. Questions on this $3 million line item? Anyone? There is detail in the book, as the superintendent has pointed out, but it is the time to ask questions.
On instructional services?
Instructional services.
Yeah, page 35 gives a little
Yep.
detail.
Thank you.
What are the main drivers for the increase?
The main drivers for the increase there are, there's a $41,000 in instructional services, which is what we would consider an unfunded mandate for students who are expelled. And the mandate says that they must have the same amount of instruction as students who are in school with us. So it would take extra costs in tutoring for those students. And then there's also additional expense in consultation and physical therapy expenses as well.
That's is that the 224, the pupil personnel services?
That's correct.
Yep.
Is this a new mandate, unfunded mandate?
On that line 301?
Yes.
That is, yes.
This year, this coming year, this first
Yes.
year?
That's my understanding.
Okay.
So now, if a child is so poorly behaved that they get expelled from school, we have to provide private tutors for that child at home?
It really has more to do with the time that we must provide instruction, and it basically is offering the same amount of instructional time that you would have if you were in school.
Yes.
So yes.
It's kind of what I thought you were saying. Really? Yeah, no kidding. Wow. Okay. Does that come from the federal government or the state government?
That's the state
Of course.
of Connecticut.
Mandate.
Mandate.
The state, it's a mandate from the state.
It's paid by the town of Fairfield.
Yeah, that part I got. Okay. How do you estimate that one? Just curious.
Average.
You're looking at how many students we would have that would be in that situation, and then trying to calculate the hours that it would take and how much you would pay on an hourly rate.
So you're calculating out how many kids you think you're going to need to expel, and then saying we're going to have to
Well, you're
provide them
looking
with this.
at your history. You're looking at your history, your historical data.
Some towns, I got to believe that's a big number. Okay. Do we have any other questions, comments, or outrage? Okay, seeing none, let's go to contracted services. So this is another, it's about a $3.3 million line item. Questions related to that? And please, if you want to yell out the page number that you want us to refer to.
It's
go right ahead.
37.
Thanks. Mr. Brown?
What's the actual on the legal fees we paid this budget season? What do we generally pay on legal fees? What are they historically?
Yeah, go ahead.
About 600,000 is what we budget. And, you know, as we've discussed before, sometimes, last year, I think we were about 25,000 under. This year, so far, we were okay. Now it looks like we may be going slightly over. And then there were some years where we were, seemed like not even in the ballpark.
How about a contract year? Year where you're going to be negotiating? Does it fluctuate?
It goes up when we have more outstanding contracts, yes.
Okay.
So you'll be negotiating this fall, those contracts, correct?
We will start with the teachers this fall.
Yeah.
Some of the others will start shortly thereafter.
Right.
So has extra money been added to legal expenses because of the upcoming contract that needs to be negotiated? No?
No.
So we just hoping that the other expenses go down for legal expenses from the previous year? Or, I don't know how that works.
Honestly, from year to year, again, you have to look at historical, because we don't ever know on any given year what is going to have a large impact. We can have one issue that's a $100,000 issue, and then the next year you don't have an issue like that. So you try to do the best you can based on our historical, and we're always negotiating as well, you know, when you look over time, so that's included in that analysis.
How much did our last negotiation cost? Do we know, Mrs. Manzel? For the teachers?
No, I'd have to get that for you.
Can we just take a look at that, just so we know? Other questions on contracted services? Mr. Becker?
Just in regards to the book here, so the 600, is that anywhere else within the book, or you just have that number? Like, am I missing, you know, in the breakouts? What page we'd go to find sort of this breakout for these 4 items under
We'll
here?
find it and tell you.
If you could just point me to where, because I'm thumbing through.
74.
Page 74.
74 is what we'll get, okay.
And it's towards the top right, about the 4th item down.
So that's where the legal is listed, okay. So, got it. So it starts, you're taking, okay, so 305 starting on, okay. It's a little bit broken up, I guess, and that's, right, it's there, but it's, okay. Okay, that's it for now.
Any other questions on contracted services? Seeing none, let's go to transportation. And this is the contractual increase. This is going from 7.9 to 8.3 million.
We have a 2.5%, yes, increase. There is also an additional bus at $72,000, and there is a consultant at $15,000 because we will be working on this contract.
When is that contract up? I was going to ask that.
Yeah, it's at the,
17, 18 to last year.
17, 18 last year, and we had actually got a pretty good reduction last time we did this contract, which I think might have predated you being here, Mrs. Manzel. I don't remember.
Just on the fringe.
Just on the fringe, yeah. Mr. Fickey, we got a pretty good contract last time, didn't we, when we put this out to bid? And we're going out to bid with this contract again? We're not just going to try to use the same vendor, correct?
Well, the town is going to go out.
Yeah, well, but this contract will be going out to bid under our bidding procedures. Okay. And this is, why the extra bus route?
There were some overcapacity buses and some time frame issues.
I want Mr. Fickey to come up.
Yeah, he can come on up. Mr. Fickey, come on up. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Dwyer.
We have some bus routes that are extremely long, and on any given day, with traffic and everything else, they show up to school late. We have some buses that the routes are over capacity. So
The routes are over capacity. Are the buses over capacity then?
yes,
They are.
there's physically, you're putting 3 to a seat on a middle school bus, which doesn't fit very well.
Right. And we still have the issue at the high school, though, where a lot of those buses go underutilized because kids are driving and the like?
I think some of it's driving, some of it's the length of the ride. The kids don't want to sit on the bus, so they have their parents take them to school.
If we make them longer, will more people take their kids to school and we can eliminate buses?
I think we might find out. As the numbers increase, I had a couple of parents and through a couple board members that were concerned, and we were watching video on a regular basis and trying to count kids getting off and on from the cameras to see how many were actually on there, and they were high school students sitting 3 to a seat.
Really?
So, we did have a couple routes that we started shifting stops to another bus that maybe had the same number of students assigned,
Right,
but we didn't have the ridership,
right.
so we would move stops to another bus. And we hate to do that, but, this year, we've been doing it on all 3 levels.
Yeah. I think I've said this before, but I never want your job.
You can come down and visit for a while.
Do we have other questions on transportation?
Are we legally allowed to have 3 people per seat?
Yes, the capacity of the bus is 71 passengers.
Okay.
So,
That's
I mean,
3 per seat for every row, for every
yeah.
seat?
Well, we have some 84s and we have some 54s, but primarily, the majority of our buses are 71 passenger.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else? Seeing none, we'll go on. Mr. Fickey, thank you, and we'll talk to you in a little while as well. Tuition. And the next line item is $5.2 million, and this is tuition. And again, this is something we spoke about earlier, correct? This is the out-of-town tuition, and this would be the line item, or rather, relative to this, would be some of the residential costs that you were talking about as well, correct?
On this, if you look at page 39,
I'm not saying it's in here now, I'm saying
Right.
this is where it would go, though, right? Or related to, right?
I think I'm understanding yes,
Yeah.
yes. And the increase that you're seeing, half of that is for new magnet tuition and half of that is for special education tuition.
So talk to us about the magnet tuition, because if I understand that correctly, there's been a change in that as well. Can you explain that to us?
Well, and probably the best thing to do is if you look on page 87, because it actually gives you a breakdown of the magnet tuition. And I think one of the fallacies that I think has been in the news is that we were not paying any magnet tuition, when in fact we
Right.
were. These are the 2 new magnet schools.
Which is why I didn't understand this. Right.
That's correct, that they are now going to start billing for. But
Are these 2 actually new schools, or are they're just starting to charge us for these 2 schools?
Just starting to charge.
Okay.
Discovery Magnet, and that's Fairchild Wheeler.
And is that going, who gets that, who gets those funds? Who do you write the check to?
Bridgeport, right?
Bridgeport.
Yeah, Bridgeport. And I think it's worthy, I think, just to note that the Connecticut system, is unique in that you do have these flow from district to district. And so I know that I don't want to bring up the topic we were talking about earlier, but, we bring in less students with funding, less than we actually send to Bridgeport. We have 235 students that are in magnet schools in Bridgeport. And if we said tomorrow, let's just not send students to magnet schools, I'm not really sure where we would put them. And so we do pay, a Bridgeport a fee, and our children are getting a phenomenal education that their parents are choosing for them. And it's actually, I feel like, great for the school district and allows us to have the capacity that we need for the students that are here.
Right.
Yeah.
Much like we work with our private schools, and that's why we do the private transportation, right? The only difference, and I just wouldn't be right if I didn't point this out, is that 70% plus of the funding for the Bridgeport Public Schools and these schools come from the state anyway.
Right.
So we're paying for it indirectly, and then we're paying for it directly. Because we're not getting 70% of our funding from the state, right?
And I would say that that's an issue you'd want to take up with the state. But what I
just
can say,
pointed out.
if those 235 children were here and we had capital costs that go along with educational costs, we would also be paying for that.
Right, so we're net up like 150. Okay. What else? Any other questions? Mr. Timniak?
Yes. All right, good evening. I apologize for being late. I was at a Boy Scout meeting tonight with my son, which ended at 8, so just let you know why I wasn't here on time. My question is, are the out-of-town tuition students, are they counted in the town enrollment number, overall enrollment number?
Special ed?
No.
Special ed? No.
These students
The
are not
magnet
in our
school
enrollment
students?
numbers.
I don't think so, but I'd want to check that. How Malone does that.
That, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I would want to check that, how Malone did that, and there may be, I may have a senior staff member that knows that study well enough. They very, very likely could calculate 2 different ways, but that I don't know.
But the expense is included for the $3,000 per student. So shouldn't the number be included?
Well, there's one thing to project how many students are in your entire district that live in your district. Then there's another calculation that is how many seats do you need and what is the capacity. That's what I would need to look at our study. And again, I don't know if I have a senior staff member that can possibly answer that. We can certainly get that answer for you.
Thank you. Any other questions on tuition? We're on the tuition line item. Seeing none, let's go to other purchased services, which is about $1.4 million in expenses. Questions on this line item? Anybody? There are write-ups in the book, as we've looked at previously. And this item is largely
Page 41.
flat. Questions?
Just
Go ahead, Mr. Becker.
Just again, with the pages, so the 321, professional development, curriculum writing, which seems to be going up the most, where's that tying back to? What page number?
The detail?
Yes.
It's 84 and 85.
So 84.
I don't know whether it's great that you know that or sad that you know the page numbers.
Right, yeah, it's rolling.
Give everybody a minute to take a look at it.
So, as we're going through this, one of the things that they did for us, I think they started at least last year, maybe earlier, but they provided like an Excel version of this, something that we can kind of on the computer go back and then tie back some of these numbers on our end as we're looking at it. And I don't know how you produce this, but for Dr. Jones, is that something that you can look into,
One
some
year
sort
we-
of an electronic
Yeah, one year we
version
did
for
try
us?
to show on a page, like on page 41, and say, the detail is on this page, so that you could more easily go from one to the other. We've not presented the budget in an Excel format.
So two things. One would be that sort of a summary, and then the other one would be something electronic on our end, similar to what Mr. Mayer's been doing for us for the last couple of years. I don't know if Dr. Jones, if you can look into that and get back as to, what you can do, maybe on both of those, but I think that would be helpful for us. I think we found it particularly helpful on the, some of us at least, on the town side. So I know that you may have to go back and figure out how this is all compiled and get back, but if you could, that'd be helpful. The administration.
I can certainly explore that.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Other questions on other purchased services? I guess we're still on, correct? All right, seeing none, let's go on to supplies, text, and materials. Now, we talked about this earlier. We look at it, there was a large increase last year. There was an estimated actual this year, and then there was the proposed. And as I recall, we pulled forward some of this spending to take advantage of it due to a surplus situation last year, because we knew we had somewhat of a deficit situation this year. So the 3.6 is a little bit too high, quote unquote, and the 3.3 is a little bit too low, right? Because there was a little bit of a transfer there. And then you're going back down to 2.8. And as I recall, the discussions from prior year, there were a couple of large curriculum swap-outs, textbook swap-outs, that had to be funded during those years. Is that correct?
I think I understood you correctly, yes. And our pre-purchase last year was in social studies?
Right. And then aren't you doing a science or something this year, or there was also math, I thought?
Well, math, we also implemented math this school year, yes.
Okay.
And you can see those, they're on page 94.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's just fun doing it by memory.
yeah.
Anybody else? Questions, comments on textbooks? We did touch on this a little bit earlier. All right. I don't have any.
Chris.
Mr. DeWitt, do you have something?
Just a quick question. We're still using consortiums for purchasing our books through the town, correct? Dr. Title initiated in his first year through the town that we would use a consortium purchasing.
We use consortiums anytime we can, but I'm not sure textbooks.
Oh, I thought that
Well,
was
in
the
that
primary
category.
use of them. maybe it's a question for our new purchasing director.
Can we find out what we still are using them on? Just because I know there was a lot of work on that. In fact, there was all sorts
Which
of things.
we rewrote the
written.
policy to allow it.
Oh.
It was never allowed before, that's correct.
So you want to know what we're using the consortiums for?
Yeah, let's just
Please.
see how we're doing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. Anything else? Anybody else? Let's go on to operations and maintenance of buildings. This number it's roughly a $10 million number. It fluctuates within a few $100,000 each and every year. Do we have questions, comments, concerns? We touched on this a little bit because there was a slight reduction here, I guess, in your original proposal versus what you came up with, right? What do we have? Any questions on operations? Do we have any concerns here? Are you concerned about falling behind or delaying things, or are we, forget about when we get to the bigger topic?
Is Mr. Cullen going like this?
No, I don't see him. He's kind of sitting behind you. He is. Mr. Cullen, you want to come up and speak to it a little bit?
Good evening. For the record, Tom Cullen, Director of Operations. We do have some mandates that have come in from the state related to hazardous materials
I'm
that we're
shocked.
dealing with. Asbestos 3-year inspections is something new that's coming up to walk through all of our schools and just identify how they're doing in place. Issues with PCBs whenever we're doing any gym floor repairs, replacement and work, and radon gas every 5 years, which we're doing this 2017 reevaluation. So that's one item we're looking at. We certainly have projects that increase. We're doing new work with filtering, chemical filtering on all our new boilers that we've put in now and have completed, and chemical treatment of fuel. Since we're burning natural gas, we still have oil in the ground at 5 schools and in day tanks. So we have to do work like that. Those kinds of things we're monitoring. But generally, we're trying to stay ahead.
Mr. Walsh, did you have a question? Then I'll go to Mrs. Marmion.
But the driver of the increase pursuant to the budget is not so much as holding back on any maintenance. It seems to be the utility service decrease that was the negotiated rates, correct? Because it reduced your utility cost by $403,000.
It's a big part of it, but there was a decrease in some projects that Dr. Title had built up over the last few years.
Decrease in what type of projects?
We were carrying somewhere around $850,000 for projects. We've dropped that to $545.
And those are the projects you were just talking about?
Some of them.
Some of them, what were the other ones?
If you go to page,
You like how Tom just threw the last guy under the bus?
Yeah, the budget increase is 200, you reduced 268,000
right,
in operations and maintenance.
page 155.
He didn't hear me.
Sorry, I didn't.
I said, I love it how you just threw the last guy under the bus. It was Dr. Title's fault.
Oh, we took capital. Well, that's only $99,000.
All right.
No, he's talking maintenance.
Questions, comments, concerns here? Go ahead, Mr. Becker.
Just, when you talk about the projects, you're talking about the smaller capital projects that are built up in here, that he had up at 800, you brought down to 500?
Correct. We consider those
Which
maintenance
is more of a
projects.
capital item, right? Okay.
Well, no, they're
These are not
included,
capital
they're
items.
included in the operating budget, so.
No, I'm not talking about capital, I'm not talking about capital
okay.
recurring, I'm saying that they're under...
Capital line item.
They're in the capital line item.
Right.
That's coming down. Right, like we were on maintenance, but same, I mean, it's
It's
under your
both.
territory,
I
but it's under the
understand.
capital. Okay, just making sure.
Mrs. Marmion, you had a question, sorry.
I just need some clarification. So you mentioned we just got a state mandate to do 3-year inspections, asbestos, PCBs, radon gas. Is that a new mandate, or are the costs related to those inspections in the current
The-
operations and maintenance of buildings budget?
The 3-year asbestos inspection is a new mandate that just came out in
It's-
January.
Since you put this budget together?
Yes. The PCBs and the radon we have been following, that's not new, but we knew it was coming up, so we have to budget for that.
So you're going to need to hire consultants, I'm assuming, to come in to the buildings for the asbestos?
Correct. Consultants for that work, and if an issue is found, a repair or mitigation.
What's the guesstimate on the cost of hiring somebody to go through all of the schools and the buildings to do inspections like that?
I don't consider it a lot. I would say the asbestos piece is probably going to run $3,000 to $5,000.
Per school?
The radon piece was $3,800 recently. The piece that's unknown is if
Mitigation.
something is found or an issue comes up.
Right.
We need to mitigate it or do a repair.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on, we're really on operating maintenance as well as capital?
Well, under
Go
the
ahead.
under the capital, I'm just trying to tie back the 850 number. You're more so talking about, you sort of had a list this year that could have been up at 850 that's at 5?
Yes.
Because I'm looking at the 15, 16's at 366, and it goes to 482, and then it goes, to this year at 458. Right,
They were
so you're,
carrying some projects that had it up at 840-something.
But
They pared it back and have it at 544.
but never actually appeared in the budget at that. It's just more sort of your wish list, things you're churning through. You're able to
considered
just
page
not-
155. Those maintenance projects at the schools
Yep.
were higher than the 545 requests there.
Those are the ones you're actually going to
back.
do after
Correct.
the cut.
Correct.
If
No,
if
not
the
the
superintendent didn't cut 268,000, this number would be that much bigger.
Correct.
Okay, so this is the after. So that
After the superintendent, but not after everything else.
piece.
But the 554 doesn't tie back to the 458 number that's actually in capital outlay in the budget book. It's like your list is a little bit bigger than,
But it's not capital, it's maintenance. It's operations and maintenance, right?
but he's saying that this list of 544 is in,
None of those are capital, they're too small.
No, they're in page 78. If you go back to 78 and 79, they're listed at each school.
Right.
okay.
Right.
Okay, I see what you're doing. Okay. That makes
Thank you,
more
Mr.
sense.
Becker.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We're really in operations, maintenance of buildings, and capital. We can go to Mr. Walsh.
There's two projects here in regards to Holland Hill and Mill Hill. Both schools we're looking at possibly doing some major renovations to. And I just want to make sure that that work's not going to be wasted, that that area, once we'll be able to use all that stuff. It won't be ripped up with any of the plans of what's going forward.
Correct. They will not be wasted.
Okay, so we could use everything with what the plans are for those buildings at this point.
Yes.
Great. I presume that was the case, but I just want to make sure.
Yes, and we've talked with the Holland Hill Building Committee about what we were proposing in the budget.
Okay. Was there any reason that wouldn't just be rolled into their budgets, the Holland Hill portion?
It's a question that comes up every time there is a large project. We can't assume in the Board of Ed operating budget to eliminate projects at specific schools, hoping that a building committee will pick this all up. These are generally tracked on an annual basis. We identify them as priority 1, 2s, or 3s, and we continue to put them in. We do share them with the building committees when we're doing that work, and we have had discussions about not doing some of them. There was a playground replacement at Holland Hill we removed because the addition's going where the playground was going to go, so things like that. But some of these are related to asbestos tile that's breaking up under the carpet, and teachers know about now, and we've tested it, so we want to move forward with replacing that for safety reasons.
We don't get any reimbursement from the state on any of these projects, correct?
Not if these are considered maintenance and repair, so no.
Okay, so even if we had it rolled into the Holland Hill project, would this still be considered maintenance?
No. If we could roll them into a building committee, they could be considered eligible for reimbursement.
Okay. I mean, Holland Hill's not that much, it's $5,000, but, the other one's starting up to almost $30,000. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions on these line items? Seeing none, I'm going to go on to dues and fees, which is a very small one of $83,000. Do we have any questions on that? Thank you, Mr. Collins. All right.
I just,
Dues and fees? No? I'll open up in a minute, and I'll go to Mr. Bateson and then Mrs. Marmion if there's another one. Anybody have anything on dues and fees? So at this point, we've gone over every categorization of expense within the budget. It's a pretty good way to go through it, I find. Now we'll go into any other questions that haven't been answered, so I'll go first to Mr. Bateson.
Yeah, thank you. Quick question. I don't know if we, page 22, other sources of revenue. Has the board considered anything to, it looks like we have a decrease in expected revenue. Some of those, they look a little light compared to actual in previous years. Is there any discussion on the board to maybe revisit those in light of what's happened at the state level?
We have put the item on our March 14th agenda. Normally, we wait until May when all town bodies have met and acted, and then look at the what-ifs. But because of the magnitude of the changes, we'll be talking about it at both our March and April meetings, because the size of the cut that we have to deal with now is so much greater than what we normally deal with, that we'll get into program services. We can't not touch program services because you can't find $4 million in little bits and pieces hither and thon. And so we'll start that discussion March 14th. We won't have and this is what we're going to do on March 14th. We will explore ideas that different board members have and the staff have in both March and April board meetings, because it's not fun for any of us in this room, either sitting behind me or sitting in front of me.
Question on that. So that goes to, and then I'm going to go to Mrs. Marmion. I think you were up next, right? Did you have a comment?
I actually had the same question in terms of things like fees. When will you actually look at things like fees as making up revenue? So, thank you.
Yeah.
Which goes to the question that I had, which we're discussing your proposed budget. That's already due to other circumstances being adjusted quite heavily. Where does the board and the administration stand in reviewing what those reductions might mean to the school system next year?
Just answered that.
Is that a different way of asking Mr.
It's the same question.
Bateson's question? Because
Well, he was addressing revenue. I'm talking about the expense side.
Oh,
Is
and
there
I was-
anything you want to
I was
say?
addressing both sides with my answer, is we will talk about
Okay.
potential impacts on program services in March and April. We won't make the decision probably until the June meeting. We normally make it in May.
Okay.
We have pushed that final decision off to June because
So there's nothing to share with, hey, this is what a $4 million...
that won't start to be formulated probably till the first meeting in May.
Really?
We'll talk about different subjects. So we will talk about the least favorite subject that I have, making this school system a semi-private school by enacting pay-to-play across the board, sports and arts.
Right.
We'll talk about that.
Okay.
Nobody wants to do that on our board, but we'll talk about it.
Okay.
So there'll be a
So
variety
there's
of things
nothing-
we talk about.
So as regards digesting the cut, there's nothing that you want to share tonight?
No.
You're going to go back and discuss that separately?
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, the clear answer is to the question, our board has not yet started that conversation. That conversation will start March 14th.
Okay. Thank you. Please, Mr. DeWitt.
So in the superintendent's impact flow slide, which I like a lot, you know, we keep hearing in the, through the media that you presented a budget, the first selectman has cut it $2,033,000. But in reality, you're right, it's 6.3, right, with the state cuts. But to just add on to the chairman's point, at the very least, you're in for a $2 million cut. I mean, that's the bare min, I mean, there's three numbers. You have the 4.25, which I understand.
That's the minimum.
Right.
That's at
So-
the very least.
So there's three numbers, right? There's the first selectman's cut. There's the 4.2, which is
Is the total of...
optimistic. Well, actually, not that optimistic. It's just telling you, it's hopefully getting the grant that we're supposed to be getting anyway, right? And then the real big number, which is the 6.3, which is just everything's going
If
to
the
hell,
2
right?
million that Mr. Tetral talked about, the governor saying the town will get it, but because it's for special ed, it will be redirected to the Board of Ed. If that doesn't happen, I quit.
So, yeah, so let me understand something. Because this is the first I'm hearing about this tonight. So, Mr. Tetro, did you cut the $2,033,000 based on the fact that you thought that the state was going to put $2 million through the town?
No.
Or is it on top of the fact that it might not come through the town?
The budget proposal I put together
Mm-hmm.
used the latest available information. That was the governor's proposal.
Which did not include the $2 million coming through the town side?
You are not correct.
Okay.
The governor's proposal did include that. That's how we found out about it.
So the net of your reduction and the governor's $2 million to the town, it's a net zero.
No.
Double, 4 million.
How is it double? The governor told, maybe I'm wrong, governor said, instead of giving $2 million to the Board of Ed, I will give it to the town. You've said that the town will then take that and send it to the Board of Ed.
You're not correct, but there's a lot of numbers there, so I don't mean to there's a lot of moving pieces on that.
Right.
But let me start with I think, a couple of the more straightforward ones, and then there's some complications that the Board of Ed can add. What the governor did, and we're not talking, was that he said, look, there's $2 million, we're increasing municipal aid, and we're giving it to the towns for special ed. What he didn't say was that the excess cost number, that's about $3.3 million, I think, in last year's budget, was going away. So that's a net decrease of about $1 million. So, in our discussions, and it would seem to make sense, was since that money is for special ed, it was targeted for special ed, and the only question is kind of which doorway does it come in, it makes sense to transfer that money over to the Board of Ed, because it's to fund the special ed piece. So the
And you
net
said that
of
number's $1 million?
No, I said there was $2 million that came in
Yeah.
to the town. There's $3.3 million that historically had gone directly to the Board of Ed, which was zeroed out. So the net difference is $1 million if we give the $2 million to the Board of Ed.
And then your $2 million is on top of that cut?
Correct.
Got it. So it's so that is truly a $4 million cut,
And-
if those circumstances you just laid out in the last 5 seconds all happen.
It's a coincidence that it's 2 million and 2 million. Those are not tied, they just happen to be the same number.
Got it. Okay.
The adjustments I made were based on the overall $14 million.
And then
But
the
that we're
$1
getting.
million residential costs is
Right.
what gets you to the 4.2.
Got it, okay.
And those are the cuts in aid. That doesn't include the $9 million on the state teacher's pension transfer cost.
So I revised my comment, so it's not, so that $2 million is not a minimum number. $4 million is a minimum number. Got it.
I'll say
Thank
it this way. If the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and RTM accept Mr. Tetro's budget, we still have to cut $4.25 million.
Right.
Got it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
To move the discussion along, I want to go to another page. Go to page 119 in your budget book. This is the second year we've done this. Mrs. Manzel, we were requesting this for many, many years, so I want to thank you one more time for working on this. I don't know that it's fully baked yet. I know last year there was a lot of qualifiers in there. I read a page full of qualifiers at the top, but we're getting closer and closer. Is that a fair statement? on a program budget? We can continue to improve on this?
It won't improve until we get a new chart of accounts.
Yeah, exactly, which, who knows when that's going to be, right? But let's take a look at this. This is actually the budget by program. So we can see how we're spending our funds. Again, I want to caution, don't read into this and say, oh my God, they're going to whack this program or they're going to whack that program. But it's actually a nice slice to look at where the town is spending its money on education and which programs are being funded and how, and which programs are being invested in. So this is a little bit of a different slice of the overall budget, just like the page we just went through was. So do we have any specific questions based on the program budget here? Or do you have anything, particularly Dr. Jones, that you want to point out relative to this budget, or anything? Let me put you on the spot a little bit. Anything that you might have found surprising coming in from a different district in a different state when you first looked at this? Positive or negative, or just, wow.
Wow. Well, in the last 11 or 12 weeks, I have been able to, I think, look at the budget deeply just because we're dealing with such significant issues. What I can say is I think the staff have been very dedicated when I go in and look at the budget at trying to run very lean. And, you know, I was in discussions today with our elementary principals, middle school principals, high school principals, all separate discussions. And I think it would be wonderful if you could have actually listened to them talk about the reductions that have been made over the last several years, and that how difficult this budget is actually going to be this year. And, you know, if you look at even the line on general education, where you're looking at actual FTE and proposed, you can see 10 positions there. That, again, is with, that's 1129 is that line. When you look at that, that is the current proposed budget. And we were just talking about $4 million in reductions. And when, you know, 80% of the budget is people, it's getting to be a real challenge to talk about reducing $4 million when we're a people-driven business.
Well, it's really unpleasant, right? Because, like you said, 70-some-odd% of your expenses are people-driven. So you don't get to your $4 million number without somewhat addressing that.
Well, and I would say, and I think for me, and I wish I could say it's unpleasant, I think what becomes really important is educational quality.
Right.
Because it all comes back to children. And that, again, is what makes it so difficult, because if you're talking about cutting a position that didn't impact children, but again, you look at that other pie chart, and in our salary and our benefits, it's primarily people that are working with children. So it's not only unpleasant, I think it's an incredibly difficult discussion for us to be having, just because we are running incredibly lean as a system. And I know that nobody likes that graph that shows where we are in Fairfield County, but again, at least for me, being new, I hear people talk about Westport and other school districts right next door that are funded very differently than we are. But I also know, you know, we're known for having fantastic arts programs, and we have a wonderful school system. It's about maintaining and sustaining, and I think this year is going to push that to the edge, where it's becoming more and more difficult when, even in this region, this regional area of southern Fairfield County, we're struggling to keep pace with our partners next door. It's going to be challenging.
In an area that is a high-cost area of the state. And so we have to look at our costs of doing business in relationship to the goods and services and personnel that we hire in Fairfield County. And that's why we more frequently, those two reasons, we're often compared to school districts in Fairfield County, but we exhibit the cost factors of Fairfield County. So we have to look at it from both sides.
How are students performing, though, based on the funds that we're putting in?
Well, I think that's key.
Performance was going up.
Well, I think that's key. I think that, again, we want to sustain and maintain a great school system.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, it's kind of like a rubber band. You stretch it, stretch it, stretch it, and eventually it breaks. And I think that what the staff and what our leadership are saying is we've stretched a really long ways just in this current budget. And what we don't want to do is have that breaking point. And we have done great things with our school system, but I do think we have to be mindful that, and we don't want to become complacent that 4 million, by the time we talk about that number over 2 or 3 months, becomes easier to say. The first time I was looking at 4 million, I didn't sleep very well that night. And it becomes easier just to think about it because you get used to it, but we don't want that to happen in this budget cycle. And part of that is staying engaged at the state level also.
Well, and here is my concern. You know, I hear you talk about it, and the reason I asked the question very specifically about what does that cut mean to you, what are you guys going to do with it, where do you stand on kind of rolling it out and thinking about it is, you know, I wish that that we could sit here and say this was a one-time thing. But the reality is, with the situation at the state level, you're looking at systematic and fundamental change going forward on an annual basis. And, you know, based on what we heard from the state delegation, who the hell knows what this ends up looking like, right? It might not be the 9 million now, but the economic realities are coming home to roost, and the changes that you guys are going to have to make are going to be fundamental changes to the way the school system operates, not one-time events, because it's not going to get any better over the next several years. So I say that as somebody who feels your pain, but just recognizes the fact that this isn't, you sit there and say, we want to maintain the quality and we want to do this and that, and this $4 million cut, oh, well, guess what? That's the new reality we're kind of living in, the way I'm looking at it from what I'm hearing from the state. I don't know if anybody else has a different viewpoint.
No, I think that of all the cuts we've talked about and all the adjustments, the most devastating one would be a share of the state teacher's pension.
Any share.
Any share, because once the camel's nose is inside the tent, the rest of the camel's going to get there sooner or later.
Right.
Second, that is probably the one that is the most likely to grow because the numbers that we know about
Right.
are not right.
Right.
So that you know, that 9 million would become 18 million very quickly. So I think that's the one that would provide the biggest structural change and challenge.
Right.
And of course, you would expect me as an advocate for the 10,000 students that if we are lucky enough that the legislature finds an alternative to that $9 million pension number and we face a smaller number, that all of our department and the 1,400 staff have shared in the pain of considering this cut, just as Mike's department heads have, all the elected officials have, that if we're lucky enough not to have to share that amount of pain, of course, the school district will hope that as the money looks more positive, that we'll be able to share in the gain and move some of those services back into our school district that we cut out based on assumptions of what might happen at the state.
Here's my problem with that assertion. I'd love to say, oh yeah, totally agree. I don't know whether this is a one-year thing, right? That's what I'm saying. I mean, when we talk to our state delegation, not only are we talking this $9 million cut, they built in something like $700 million of unknown savings and unknown givebacks that they're going to get with the unions. Good luck with that. So we might dodge a bullet now, but what I'm saying to you guys is I think we need structural change in our expense base, both on the Board of Ed side and on the town side, to deal with the new economic realities that sadly are being put upon us. And that doesn't mean that I think the school system is not being run efficiently or that we're not providing high-quality education, or on the town side that we're not doing things equally well and efficient. It means it's where we are right now with the state, and it scares the hell out of me because it is a tough challenge to keep the educational quality that you guys have all done a great job in building up. But it's beyond our control, but it's staring at us like a train coming down the tracks. And I don't know that this community can afford it. affordability is becoming a huge issue in Fairfield for a lot of our residents. Does anybody have anything?
Well, on that side, we had discussions maybe about a year ago. There were a number of, more so on the town side, but there were a number of department head type vacancies where we started talking, particularly in the technology side, where we had discussed wanting to see the town and the Board of Ed be able to potentially work together, be able to, in some form, working within the laws, consolidate. Some of it a decade ago in that instance had been done that way. And what we've sort of seen is we've sort of known this was all coming, and we find ourselves, I think, today sort of just staffed up back to normal or almost on the town side, and everyone just sort of in two different camps. And there are, I understand, some instances of working together, but I think that conversation needs to still, in some form, take place. I mean, this is a new world order for what we're doing here in Fairfield. It's only going to get worse. As the first selectman pointed out, potentially significantly worse on the teachers' side. And if it's not this year, maybe it's next year. But if not an answer for tonight, I think it's something that we do need, and maybe before our voting, but some sort of understanding as to where we're going to start going with those things. Otherwise, we're just two camps in a lot of instances replicating what we're doing and not working as efficiently as we can. If this was, I hate the business public sort of thing, right? But like, you just wouldn't be doing real life business, public, private. I mean, you just shouldn't be duplicating, I think, in some of those. So I thought that the technology was going to be the one. It sounded like a year ago that was trending, but apparently that never happened. But it's troubling, I think, in this new world where you're talking about just numbers. I don't know how you're going to find it in here, 4 million. We barely even know how we're funding on the town side. So if you could maybe, if you have something to say today, if not, maybe everyone go back and the two camps huddle and come back. But I think it's something that we need to understand, because just cutting everything versus the real changes, I think that's where we need to be looking. I think probably others hopefully agree with me.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns from board members on any topic of the budget? Mr. Walsh?
I just think, just to add on to it, I mean, I think this governor has declared war against this town and against our education system. I don't see how you take these losses without losing teachers. I really don't. But these are state losses. This is what the governor wants to do. And if the legislature follows through with the governor's budget, they join into that attack. And it will have, and I think he's being completely disingenuous in his people saying this is not going to have an effect on education, loss of teachers. He's lying, okay? It is. It is. And it's great for the towns that are getting $47 million more, like Hartford. That's great. You can run your system into the ground and get recovered, but that's not us. He's stealing our funds, going to be stealing our teachers, basically, and we're going to have to live with it, and we're going to have to find a way to make it work.
Mr. Walsh, any other questions, comments, concerns? Well, I want to take a moment and thank you for all the hard work and effort putting together a budget, particularly when there's sand shifting under your feet is not an easy thing to do. Mrs. Manzel, thank you so much for all your hard work and your team's hard work in doing this. All your department heads at the Board of Education, we thank you all. We look forward to continued dialogue. We look forward to hearing the answers to the questions that we put before you, and good luck with the task ahead of you. Does anybody have anything to say? With that, I'll turn it over to the public for a few minutes, and then we'll take our break. To the public, it'd be great if there wasn't a lot of repetitiveness given the lateness of the hour, and I appreciate your patience in us getting to you. We do want to hear from you. Let's be brief. Not questions so much, but statements are certainly allowed and welcome. We want to hear from you. So thank you.
And if
And-
two people came up at a time, it might make moving from one speaker to the other a little bit quicker. So I'll vacate.
Thank you. So does anybody want to come up? Please come up to the mic. State your name. Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. We'll see.
My name is Frank Sahagian, a teacher in town as well as a resident in town a long time. As I listened to this tonight, you guys did the right thing, going through the budget, almost line by line, but not necessarily. But all I can think of as a history teacher is Everett Dirksen. $1 million, he's spoken billions, but $1 million here, $1 million there, and all of a sudden we're talking real money. I mean, this is really an amazing situation we find ourselves in right now as a town. It is unbelievable. These $4 million hit to this education budget will be devastating. You heard Mr. Dwyer say we'll go back and do the work, which I'm sure we will, but it will be devastating. I mean, I just think you guys really need to know that, because there's so much fixed costs that really can't be changed. When you talk, Mr. Flynn, when you talk about structural changes, I really don't know what that means. I mean, I really think that's somewhat easy to say, but very difficult to envision what that structural change will look like.
I don't disagree.
I would also add, Mr. Tetro, I would appreciate if we could learn what the other other towns more similar to ours, not regional towns, how they're handling this situation, not just the regional districts. But what is Westport doing? What are they doing, that $2 million of the $9 million? Are they doing the same thing? Are they taking a portion of it and hitting to the education budget, or are they absorbing that all in the town? I think that would be good for us to know before we go ahead and do that, because $2 million of the $4 million is huge. Just to last point, one thing, this budget is, I've gone through it and I've been in this town a long time, this is an aggressive budget, a very aggressive budget. When you look at the premises that have been established in terms of, there are nine sections in the elementary budget, in the elementary school budget, that are 1 to 2 students away from having to go to another section that is not budgeted. But that's what I mean by an aggressive budget. There is no room in this budget. Don't lose sight of the fact that the principals and the headmasters asked for $2 million more, and Dr. Jones had already cut that out. So there has been already so much trimming to this budget that $4 million, I know you asked the appropriate question, and we have to go back and look at it, but I assure you, $4 million will be devastating to this educational budget.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Any other comments?
Yeah, hi, Bob Smoller. I'm the president of the Fairfield Education Association, and I want to thank you for your hard work. I know this isn't an easy process for you.
Are you a town resident, sir?
I am not a town resident. Would you prefer I not speak?
Don't normally
We don't normally allow
Okay,
non-town
then I won't.
residents. Thank you, sir. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Suzanne Miska. I am a town resident.
Can you give your address, Suzanne, just because they need it for the
Sure,
record?
123 Rygate Road. I won't take too much time. I sent you all an email today, rather lengthy. I appreciate your patience and tolerance in looking at it. I come tonight because I do support the Board of Ed budget, but I think the bigger issue that I've listened to again tonight is that it's time that the town has to come together. It's time that we all decide what the direction is that we want to go in as a town. I agree. I think the state has a plan. I think the governor has a plan. I think regionalization across the state educationally is probably the direction that we're going in, whether we like it or we don't. I just think that it's a time for us to start looking at a big picture, because we're building, we're making space, we're looking at programs, we're trying to make all these things work, and yet the sand underneath us is being taken away. My question on the pension, the $9 million teacher pension, is what is the liability Why do we as a town have to pay that liability if it's a contractual agreement between the state and the teachers union? I mean, what happens if the town of Fairfield and the town of Westport all turn around and say, no, sorry, sue us, come find us, come see where you can get the money. We don't have it. We don't have it available to you. I mean, I'd like to understand even mathematically, maybe it can be put on the town website, where the calculation comes from. Because if you took $9 million against our teacher number, you're looking like 15,000 being put to pension on an annual basis. It just is unfathomable. I'm assuming we're backloading because that's why the number is so large. But, you know, at some point, we have to make a stand, and whether we make a stand as just the town of Fairfield or the town of Westport or whatever, but I think we have to come together not only as our town and start taking a look at how we can change the cross-generation, whether it's technology, billing, et cetera. But I also think it's time that all the towns in this DRG get together and say, hey, hold on here, we've got a problem, we're not going to pay for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. Much appreciated. Anybody else? Please. And thank you for your email earlier today as well.
I've had the opportunity to be a parent.
I'm sorry, can you just state your...
Christine McMaster Sander, 71 Judson Road.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I've also had the opportunity now to become a teacher in your district. And I do understand from the outside what my children have benefited from. I have a senior at Ludlow High School, top of her class. She's really, every aspect of our school system is so worth investing in. I've taught in inner city public schools in New York. I now live here. I'm happy to be here. And now I see what it's like from the inside. So I intimately know my colleagues. I see how hard they work. Every day I go to work and I see happy children, and I love my job. And I really do think our school system as a town is worth coming together and trying to figure out a way to pay for what we have the best that we can, irregardless of the, and maybe go to the state and lobby and try to influence them so we can be funded. But I do think Dr. Jones's budget is a fair budget for this year, and I know that from, you know, my son goes to Sherman Elementary School, and he's in a full class. You know, every seat is taken. I can't imagine where, if you took teachers out of that school, their room is tight. We're in a portable, and we don't have a lot of room. So if you reduce staff to an extent where you made class sizes larger, I don't know even how that might look. So I think it's super important to support the budget that she's put forward, and I'm here on a Tuesday night late to be able to say that. And I thank you very much for everything that you do and you provide for us and our children, because it's a wonderful education. And I hope that we get through this process in a way that is good for everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for being here tonight. Anybody else? Seeing none, we're going to wrap this up again. Thank you very much. We're going to take our long-awaited break for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and continue with the 3 other departments. Everyone, thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for your public comments. All right. Do you have any opening statement or anything?
Just a reminder that this is the part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires that, requires that, that for students who are not residents of Fairfield, but who attend the Fairfield, who attend private schools, they're parentally placed by their parents in private schools located in Fairfield, we are obligated to do the child find activities under IDEA. That means evaluations. And so we have a small team of part-time people who conduct all of those evaluations for those students under IDEA, and that's what this, this account funds.
Questions, comments on this account? It's $148,000, a $6,000 increase, $6,500 over last year. Questions, comments from anybody? Chris DeWitt, you have your hand up? Okay. Moving on.
This
Oh,
includes
hang
the
on.
parochial
I knew-
schools
I knew
in
if I
town?
waited long enough.
These are all of the parochial and non-public schools, all of the private schools, all of
Yep.
the parochial schools
Okay, through high school.
through high school.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's go on to Department 2531, Private School Transportation, page 175. Vicki, how are you?
Not too bad.
And I meant what I said about not wanting your job. Why don't you tell us what's changing in this? Is this all due to the bus contract, or pretty much?
Pretty much, yeah. I think there was a reduction on the fuel. The numbers that we got went up, and then they went down, and then they went down a little more. I think the purchasing department is currently getting futures, so the numbers have been pretty good. I think about two.
So this is an increase of like $4,800 in fuel. Are you saying this could go down? Did you just give us a good guy?
I think it depends on which publication came out.
Okay.
Because I know that there were 3 movements. There was an article that I read in the government magazine, brought it up to $2.69 a gallon, but I think the last bit of information we had was down around $2.07.
So can we get revised numbers on this? to
Slight
see?
increase in cost of fuel, yes.
So this is coming down a little
This
bit?
is, no, this is correct. It's going from 85 to 90.
Thought you just said there was a decrease.
The original price was $2.69 a gallon, I think.
Original meaning last year's?
No, the start of the budget.
So what is this one?
There
doing?
are continuous updates throughout the
Right.
budget process.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out which one this is on.
This is the final submission that we sent to
The
Linda.
90,000.
This is the per gallon rate that was given by the purchasing department, correct?
Correct.
We just had this discussion the other night. Mr. Tetro told us there was a number locked in. This is it.
Any other questions on this budget?
I'm
Ms. Marmon?
confused. Is the price,
Go
going
ahead.
down or not?
What's that?
Is price going down at all?
Well, it depends on where you start.
Okay.
So, to some degree, yes, but like I said, there've been a number of estimates through the process, so it's gone up and down over the last 4 or 5 months, so that's what Mr. Fickey, I think, was referring to.
At what point do you lock that price in?
When we think we've got the best deal for the year. It's independent of we use a number in the budget book because we have to fill out the budget book, but we're going to lock it in when we think it's the best deal we're going to get.
Can you just report back to us what's going on with the price here and if there's any change and any volatility that we can take advantage of? Mrs. Marmon, you got cut off there.
Yeah, I just have a question about the late buses. Are we required to provide late buses? I know there was some question in the public schools in Fairfield a while ago about the late buses and reducing the days, I think, from twice to once a week. Are we required in Fairfield to pay for those late buses?
Anything that we do for the public school, according to the statute, we have to do for the private school. Fairfield Country Day pays for half of their own late buses because they wanted the bus, instead of getting cut, they wanted the service to continue. And theirs is, they send the younger kids home at 3 o'clock and the older kids home at 4:30. But we break it in half and they pay for their extra buses. Notre Dame, we've been very fortunate. they order their late bus by usage. If they don't have anybody by 1 o'clock that signs up for the bus, there's no late bus that day. If they get somebody at 10 in the morning that says, I need, I got to stay, then they call. Fairfield Prep uses the buses Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday as needed, same type thing that we do with the public schools. If Ward doesn't, or Fairfield Woods doesn't need a bus, they call us and tell us that we don't need a bus that day, and that would save 3 buses at a cost of about $50 a bus.
So I guess just as a follow-up, so if in the Board of Ed looks moving forward and says, we can't, we're going to cut the late bus on the public school side, I thought it was just once a week now they have it, maybe they have it twice a week.
Twice a week.
Twice a week. So if you made that decision, would that then carry over to the private schools if we're not providing it to the public school kids? Just hypothetically, if you cut from...
Statute-wise, I think it would. Anything that, if the board chooses to cancel late buses for the district, then, we would notify the private schools that that has happened, and there, you would save $20,000, or I don't even think it's that much, but $18,000 on the town side.
Any other questions on private school transportation?
Can you just say that one more time? We could possibly be canceling this, and we'd have to cancel it for the town side too, on the late buses?
Yes.
Okay.
According to the statute, that's the way that it's written. Anything that, we have to offer them anything that the Board of Education does.
Okay. But it has to be cut on both sides.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Anything else? Seeing none, Mr. Fickey, thank you very much. Maureen, thank you very much. That is the end of our program for this evening. A programming note, Thursday night, we are back here, same time, same channel. I will not be here on Thursday. Mr. Brown will helm the meeting, which means it'll be a much quicker meeting. But I'll be out of town for the evening. Sorry to miss it. But any other questions, comments, concerns from board members? Anything that anybody wants to go over before we adjourn for the evening?
What is the...
Mr. Walsh, gentlemen, we still have something going on here, so go ahead, Mr. Walsh.
There was a letter from the governor that Mr. Timniak was good enough to send to me, that it was sent to CCM.
Yeah, we spoke about that early in the meeting
Okay,
today.
I wasn't here when
Yeah.
that was discussed. So,
We're just waiting for information back from the state. Mr. Timniak, I think you heard that the legislature might vote on this tomorrow?
Mike was with me today at the CCM meeting, and we heard that they are looking to present legislation to the House of Representatives and then to the Senate tomorrow, which would hypothetically allow towns to either delay their budget vote, and they had some notwithstanding language to town charters. It's developing. Nobody knows what it looks like, and they were asking CCM board members to submit their positions this afternoon, and Senator Austin, who is also the first selectman of Sprague, who's presenting the legislation, was looking to move fast on it tomorrow. So I don't know what it looks like.
So we need to understand what this may mean for us relative to our charter and everything else, correct? Mr.
There are a couple different initiatives. The
Yeah.
letter you had was from the governor and, I guess, majority leadership saying they were talking about it. The senator spoke to our meeting this morning, saying she had language in and she was looking for that, and she was trying to get a vote on it tomorrow. So if that turns around or doesn't that fast, if it does, we'll know what the language is.
Right.
If it doesn't, there's still other initiatives trying to do the same thing.
Okay. So we should have more clarity either later this week or early next week. We
Ready?
would hope.
Either more or less.
Right. So, Mr. Leclerc, did you have a follow-up to that?
So how does that affect Fairfield? Don't we have the May 1st date for the mill rate in our charter?
The,
For the, or the RTM annual meeting? Isn't it very
I
specific
don't
in
know
our
if,
charter itself?
as memory serves, I don't think there's a date in our charter. I think it's all based on a series of timings and 30-day notice for town meetings, that type of thing. But state statute would trump that. If it basically said we didn't have to do that, that would excuse us from that requirement.
We can get a legal opinion on that once that legislation comes out.
We're talking about that already.
Yeah, I would just want to say to your question, Mary, like, everything today which was talked about was in the hypothetical stage. And until something passes and something's actually written on paper, I don't know what it would be.
And the other thing is, I mean, Mr. Mayor, you've done some looking at our charter, and well, the RTM may have to act by a date specific based on a calendar, not a specific date, but based on a calendar of events. You had indicated, and again, we want legal review on this, that it does not say that the Board of Finance needs to set the mill rate.
No, basically all it says is after the RTM has had their meeting, which you said is correct, at a specific time frame, then the Board of Finance shall set. There's no time element in the paragraphs in the charter at all.
Well, actually, the loophole is bigger than that. It says there will be a town meeting.
Right.
Does not say there shall be a vote at that meeting, so they can actually call the meeting, hold it, and then postpone the vote.
Yeah, so I think the town can easily wait.
And then the issue, as we talk logistics, is then the question is, we can't wait forever because we actually have to get money in order to run the town in July and August and through the summer. So at some point, we do need to send out tax bills. So we're going to need a strategy that as we talked on email earlier, there's about 4 or 5 different moving pieces, at least, as part of that decision.
What we're trying to do is get within the next couple of weeks what our options are. So everybody's on the same page as to our options and the very real concern of getting cash in the door. But the key thing is, what is our legal options? What can we do? You know, it might be prudent to wait as long as we possibly can if we can operate, you know, cash-wise by doing that.
Yeah. Based upon my reading of all the literature, it's the town does not have to set the mill rate at any specific date. The town, from the state's regulation perspective, has the right to send out tax bills based upon current year tax rates.
Right.
And
again,
the
you've
town,
said that, and I understand it.
And the town could also do a line of credit. Yeah.
I want the legal opinion.
There's a legal opinion and also certain logistical complications.
Correct.
If you start basically sending people a bill that is not the total amount, that type of, so all those considerations go into this. I think that so we just want to make a fully informed decision, and your questions certainly were a big part of that.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Becker?
It's a question about, I guess, the CCM meeting today. I mean, has there been pressure at that level from the towns to the state reps who keep putting this, it seems like, onto it's the governor's. Well, the governor's budget's DOA. Okay, great. Well, you're the legislature. It's in front of you. Put all of your other business aside and deal with this. I mean, this is affecting everybody. I mean, maybe with the exception of some of the cities and maybe some towns, but a limited number.
They can't budget because they don't know.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah, they may very well, if this all falls apart, they could have a hole sitting there.
I mean, our state delegation was here, so I'm not quite sure what your question is.
Well, when they were here, they seemed to allude to the I'm just one person or we're just 4. So my question is, from CCM, is there pressure on them to start adjusting? And I think I said it that night, but go back and that group of, I think Jim said it was 129 towns, get together then and say, by the way, now we're in charge, not the governor. Let's do this. So is CCM applying pressure to them to stop talking about changing the dates and enacting legislation like that, but to just go do the budget? I mean,
that was part of the conversation today, and a state senator took us through the steps they have to go through, and that their appropriation committee doesn't have a report due out until late April. Their finance committee doesn't have their report due out, and finance is the funding part, the revenue part. That's not due out till a week after that. The issue is it's not until April 15th that people start turning in their tax returns, that type of thing. So they don't know what the numbers will be for the revenue side, so they can't make their budget sooner than that.
Yeah, the first quarterly tax return for this fiscal year is due April 15th, as well as the final from last year, and the state uses the information on that quarterly return cash flow to project the remaining 3 quarters.
So the short form of that was there were certain logistical issues there, and the other one was that the state assembly basically, or the state senator said, look, if you want us to revise the governor's budget, we need to look at all the details. If you want to just accept the governor's budget, then we can pass on it pretty quick, but her point was that nobody wanted them not to change the governor's budget. This has been an ongoing discussion for a number of years. So CCM is doing that. CCM is meeting not only in those sessions. I know CCM's met with the governor, CCM's met with leadership, and I know individually first selectmen and mayors like myself are going up and meeting with leadership up in Hartford.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on this topic? Stay tuned. All right, everybody, I thank everybody. It was a tough night. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Brown, do I have a second? I'll take Mrs. Marmion. All in favor? All opposed? Good night, everybody. Thank you.